Somewhere on the vast grasslands of Eurasia, roughly 5,500 years ago, a human being did something no person had ever done before. They climbed onto the back of a wild animal, gripped its mane, and stayed there. No saddle, no stirrups, no bridle as we'd recognize one. Just raw nerve and an animal that, for whatever reason, let them stay. We don't know their name. We don't know what tribe they belonged to or what language they spoke. We don't even know exactly where this happened, but that single moment, that first successful ride, changed the trajectory of human civilization more than almost any invention that came before or after it. Think about that for a second. Before this moment, human beings moved at walking speed, everywhere. For the entire existence of our species, roughly 300,000 years, the fastest a person could travel was as fast as their own 2 legs could carry them. Then, almost overnight in evolutionary terms, humans could move 4 times faster than that. They could carry loads 10 times heavier. They could cover in a single day what used to take a week. If you're using this video to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So subscribe maybe, and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I love checking the comments and seeing it's 2 a.m. in Sydney, while it's dinner time in Toronto. All of us drifting off to the same story at completely different moments. Here's what makes the story of the horse so strange when you actually dig into it. This is an animal that became, at different points in history, almost everything a society could need. A war machine capable of deciding the fate of empires. A status symbol so powerful that owning one could separate kings from peasants. A communication network faster than anything humans had built before telegraph wires existed. A farming tool that quietly powered agriculture for thousands of years. And somehow, through all of that, also a companion. Something humans grew to love, to grieve, to write poetry about. How does one species do all of that? How does a grazing animal that evolved to run from predators end up reshaping trade routes, toppling civilizations, and carrying messages across continents faster than anyone thought possible? That's the mystery we're going to sit with tonight. And I want to be upfront with you about something. Historians and archaeologists don't agree on all of it. Where exactly domestication began, when humans first rode instead of just herded, how certain technologies spread. These are real debates, still happening in academic journals right now. So as we go through this, I'll tell you what scholars broadly agree on, and I'll also tell you where the evidence gets murky, where reasonable experts land in different places. That's not a weakness of the story, honestly. It's part of what makes it interesting. Before we get into any of that, though, if you're enjoying these long history sessions, I'd genuinely appreciate it if you followed along on Spotify. It's completely ad-free there. No music interruptions, just the story, uninterrupted, which honestly makes it easier to fall asleep to. There's a link in the description if you want to check it out. It helps support the work I put into these. All right, let's go back. Long before saddles, long before riders, long before anyone thought a horse could be anything other than dinner. To understand how strange and unlikely the horse's rise really was, you have to go back much further than 5,500 years. You have to go back millions of years to a story that has almost nothing to do with humans at all. The genus Equus, the group that includes every horse, zebra and donkey alive today, first appeared in North America somewhere around 4 million years ago. That's right, North America. Not Eurasia, not the steppes we usually picture when we think of wild horses. The earliest true horses evolved on a continent where, eventually, horses would completely disappear, only to be reintroduced by humans tens of thousands of years later. Evolution has a strange sense of irony sometimes. From North America, ancient horses spread outward, crossing the Bering Land Bridge into Asia, then fanning out across Eurasia over hundreds of thousands of years. They adapted as they went, changing size, changing leg structure, changing teeth to handle different kinds of vegetation. By the time we reached the Ice Age, the period we're really interested in tonight, horses had become one of the most successful large mammals on the planet. They ranged from Spain to Siberia, from the cold woodlands of Central Europe to the open steppes of Mongolia. Different populations, different regional forms, but all recognisably horses, all fast, all social, all built for a world that was at the time absolutely brutal. Because we need to talk about that world for a moment. The Ice Age wasn't one single frozen landscape stretching endlessly in every direction. That's the popular image, but it's not quite accurate. What existed across much of Eurasia during the last glacial period was something scientists now call the Mammoth Steppe, a strange, cold, dry grassland ecosystem that doesn't really have a modern equivalent. Imagine treeless plains stretching for thousands of miles, low temperatures most of the year, but surprisingly productive grasses and herbs, able to survive the cold and the dryness. This wasn't tundra in the way we picture the Arctic today. It was closer to a cold, dry version of the African savanna, minus the heat, plus woolly megafauna. And it was absolutely full of life. Mammoths, obviously. Woolly rhinoceroses, giant deer with antlers spanning over 3 meters. Cave lions, cave hyenas, cave bears, and horses, herds of horses moving across these plains in numbers that are honestly hard for us to picture now, because wild horse populations today are a tiny fragment, a ghost, of what once roamed free. These Ice Age horses weren't uniform either. In the colder, more open steppe regions, they tended to be stockier, thicker coated, adapted to cropping short, tough grasses in freezing wind. In more temperate, wooded regions further south and west, horse populations seem to have been somewhat different in build, possibly taller, possibly adapted to a more mixed diet of grasses and forest edge vegetation. We're talking in generalities here because the fossil and genetic record from this period is fragmentary. But the broad pattern is clear enough. Wild horses were not one single, uniform creature. They were a patchwork, a set of regional populations shaped by climate, by vegetation, by whatever pressures their specific corner of the mammoth steppe threw at them. This matters more than it might seem, because it means that when we talk about the wild horse of the Ice Age, we're really talking about many different wild horses, different sizes, different coats, probably different temperaments, spread across an enormous range. Some of those populations would eventually go extinct. Others would survive into the more recent past, and 1 or 2 lineages buried somewhere in that patchwork would eventually become the ancestors of every domestic horse alive today. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. That's a story for later. Right now, picture the humans living alongside these animals. Because here's the thing that's easy to forget. For an enormous stretch of time, tens of thousands of years, humans and horses shared the same landscapes without anything resembling the relationship we think of today. No riding, no herding, no taming, just 2 species, both highly mobile, both adapted to open, harsh environments, occasionally crossing paths. And when they crossed paths, the relationship was simple. Horses were food. This is not a comfortable thing to sit with if you love horses today, but it's the honest starting point. Ice Age humans were skilled, opportunistic hunters and horses. Fast as they were still vulnerable in the right circumstances. Herd animals moving through narrow valleys, horses crossing rivers at predictable points, horses weakened by winter or injury. Human hunters learned these patterns, they tracked migration routes. They understood, probably far better than we usually give them credit for, the seasonal rhythms of the animals around them. Archaeological sites across Ice Age Europe, places like Solutré in France, show enormous accumulations of horse bones, sometimes representing the remains of thousands of animals over generations of use. This wasn't random opportunistic killing. This was systematic, repeated knowledge-based hunting, the kind that requires deep familiarity with an animal's behavior. So, in a strange way, the relationship between humans and horses that would eventually lead to domestication actually started here in this deep, practical predator and prey dynamic. Long before anyone thought about riding a horse, humans were already watching horses closely, learning their habits, understanding their movement patterns, developing, whether they realized it or not, the exact kind of intimate species knowledge that domestication would eventually require. But hunting wasn't the whole story either, because somewhere in the minds of these Ice Age humans, horses were becoming something more than just meat on the hoof. We know this because they left evidence. Not written records, obviously, nothing like that, but images, deep in caves across what's now France and Spain, places like Lascaux, Chauvet, Pechmerle, Ice Age humans, painted horses. Not occasionally, not as an afterthought, but repeatedly, skillfully, sometimes with startling anatomical accuracy. Some of these paintings are over 30,000 years old, among the oldest surviving artworks created by our species. The horses in them are depicted running, rearing, standing in herds, sometimes overlapping with images of other animals in ways that suggest complex, deliberate compositions rather than simple doodles. Now, we have to be careful here, because it's tempting to look at this ancient art and immediately assume it proves some deep spiritual or emotional bond between Ice Age humans and horses. That's a nice story, but it's not one we can actually prove. We don't know why these images were made. We don't know if they represented hunting magic, storytelling, religious ritual, or something we don't even have a modern concept for. What we can say cautiously is that horses clearly held significant meaning for these communities. You don't paint an animal deep inside a dark cave, using rare pigments with this much skill and repetition, unless that animal matters to you in some way beyond simple nutrition. Portable art tells a similar story. Small carved figurines of horses, sometimes made from ivory or bone, have been found across Ice Age Europe, some dating back over 20,000 years. These weren't just crude representations either. Some show remarkable attention to detail, capturing the shape of a horse's head, the arch of its neck, in a way that suggests the makers had studied these animals closely, probably over years, possibly across generations of shared knowledge passed down. So by the later stretches of the Ice Age, we have a picture forming. Humans who hunted horses systematically. Humans who observed horse behavior closely enough to track and predict it. And humans who, for reasons we can only partially understand, found horses significant enough to represent in art, deep underground, in spaces that clearly held some kind of special importance. None of this is domestication. None of this is even close to riding or herding or controlling breeding. This is coexistence, complicated, practical, sometimes lethal coexistence between two highly capable species sharing the same brutal, beautiful landscape. But coexistence has a way of shifting slowly, almost imperceptibly, into something else. And that raises the question that's going to carry us through the next part of this story. At what point does watching an animal, tracking an animal, even hunting an animal start to shade into something closer to control? When does a relationship built on predator and prey begin to bend toward partnership? That transition didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen in one place. It happened slowly, unevenly, probably in fits and starts across different regions of the Eurasian steppe, long before anyone left behind a bone, a bit fragment, or a piece of pottery, clear enough to tell us exactly when it began. So let's pick up the thread right at that blurry edge, where coexistence starts to lean toward control. When people talk about domesticating horses, They often imagine a single, decisive moment. Someone catches a wild foal, throws a rope around its neck, jumps on its back, and history changes overnight. Reality is almost certainly slower, messier, and harder to see. The first thing we need to untangle is language, because taming, domestication, and managed breeding are not the same process, and if we mix them up, the story stops making sense. Taming is something you do to an individual. You take a wild animal and, through time, food, and patience, you teach it to tolerate human presence. Circuses did this with lions. Falconers still do it with birds of prey. You can tame a wolf, and that wolf can be affectionate, obedient, even loyal. But if it escapes and has pups with other wolves, those pups will still be wolves. Wild, wary, genetically no different from their untamed cousins. Domestication is something that happens to a population over many generations. It's not just about who an animal lives with, it's about which animals are allowed to reproduce and which are not. It's about human preferences slowly carving new traits into a species, smaller or larger body size, calmer temperament, earlier sexual maturity. Changes in coat colour, horn shape, skeletal proportions. Over time, the descendants of a domesticated line diverge from their wild ancestors in ways you can actually measure. And then there's managed breeding, which sits further along the same path. Once people have a truly domestic population, with some degree of dependence on humans and some degree of predictable behaviour, they can begin to fine-tune, selecting stallions and mares for speed, for strength, for endurance, for milk yield, for anything that matters to their way of life. This is how you get racehorses and draft horses and tiny ponies, all from the same species. The tricky part for archaeologists is that these stages leave very different kinds of traces in the ground. Taming on its own might leave almost nothing. A few individuals captured from a wild herd, used for work or milk or status, then killed and eaten when they were no longer useful. Their bones would look almost identical to those of wild horses living at the same time in the same region. The skull doesn't grow a label that says, "This one was briefly ridden." Early domestication is more promising, but still subtle. You might start to see slight changes in body proportions. Slight shifts in tooth wear if people begin to use bits or feed different diets. Maybe an unusual pattern of ages at death, if humans are culling young males and keeping females longer for breeding and milk. Managed breeding, once it's in full swing, is much more visible. Herd structures change, skeletons change, genes change. But by the time we can see all of that clearly, the story has already been going on for centuries, maybe longer. So archaeologists have to build their case from clues, layers of imperfect, sometimes ambiguous evidence that, taken together, start to look like a pattern. Some of those clues lie in the bones themselves. Changes in the size and shape of certain bones can hint at selective breeding or at regular load-bearing from riding or pulling. Pathologies on vertebrae, joints, and limb bones might indicate repeated stress from carrying weight or being harnessed. Teeth are another key line of evidence. Bit use, even with organic materials that have long since rotted away, can leave microscopic wear patterns on the teeth, tiny facets and polishing where metal or rope rubbed against enamel. Different diets, especially grain feeding or foddering, can also alter the microscopic scratches on tooth surfaces. Then there are tools, bits and cheek pieces made of bone, horn or metal. Harness fittings, objects that only make sense in a world where people are controlling horses rather than just hunting them. Architectural traces can weigh in too, stone-lined enclosures on the open steppe. Corral-like structures near settlement sites, layers of trampled soil rich in dung, suggesting animals confined in one area for long periods rather than just passing through. Chemical and microscopic residues add another layer. Lipid traces of horse milk absorbed into pottery, manure signatures in sediments, hair and hide fibres trapped in floors and hearths, and increasingly ancient DNA, genetic signatures that distinguish domestic lineages from wild ones. Patterns of reduced diversity in certain regions of the genome, suggesting strong selection for traits like temperament or coat colour. Evidence of rapid population expansion from a limited number of founding animals. None of these categories, on their own, is a smoking gun. A corral might have held cattle, or reindeer or sheep. A bit-worn tooth might belong to a single tamed individual in an otherwise wild population. A genetic shift might reflect a climate event rather than domestication. So researchers have to step back and ask a broader question. Given the human incentives at different times and places, what kinds of relationships with horses actually make sense? For mobile hunter-gatherers on the steppe, the attraction is obvious. Horses are walking food storage, living on grass that humans can't eat, and converting it into meat and fat. If you can keep a few animals close instead of relying entirely on wild herds, you buffer yourself against bad hunting years. Then there's milk. Mare's milk is not as calorie-dense as cow's milk, but it can be fermented into alcoholic drinks and provides a valuable source of protein and sugars in marginal environments. A tamed or semi-managed herd becomes a rolling dairy, following the grass and feeding humans who follow them. Transport is the other great lure, but it probably comes a little later. Before riders, there may have been horses used as draft animals, pulling sledges or simple vehicles. Even walking alongside a loaded horse, using it as a pack animal, can extend human travel range dramatically. And hovering over all of this is prestige. Even in societies where horses are primarily meat on the hoof, there are hints that controlling them, owning them, displaying them, being seen with them conveys status. If your neighbours still have to chase wild herds, and you can point to animals that answer at least a little to your call, that sets you apart. Put incentives like that in front of scattered human groups across a vast range from Ukraine to Kazakhstan to Mongolia, and another question arises. Did horse domestication happen once, in a single core region, then spread outward? Or did different communities, facing similar environments and similar temptations, begin to tame and manage local horse populations independently? Some researchers favour a single origin model. In this view, one successful early domestication event, somewhere on the Eurasian steppe, created a line of horses so advantageous that it eventually outcompeted or replaced all other local attempts. The genetic uniformity of modern domestic horses seems at first glance to support this. Others lean toward multiple local domestications. They point to regional differences in early evidence, to hints that people were controlling horses in several places around the same time. In this scenario, what we see today would be the surviving branch of a much more tangled tree, where many early domestication experiments flickered into life and then vanished, replaced by a lineage that happened to be better suited to human needs or disease-resistant or simply more numerous. Right now, the picture is still unresolved. Ancient DNA has complicated some early assumptions, suggesting that the horse lineages most common today are not always the same as those found in some of the earliest sites with possible domestication evidence. New methods keep pushing the timeline back and forth. 1 year, a site is hailed as the earliest horse herding culture. A decade later, reanalysis downgrades it to intensive hunting with maybe a little taming on the side. Timelines shift. Models are revised, the boundary between hunting, taming, and true domestication keeps blurring the closer we look. But out of this haze, one region, one cluster of sites, will emerge as especially important in our story. A place where people were milking horses, possibly riding them, and certainly doing something that looks very much like herding. To get there, we have to ride east, into the grasslands of northern Kazakhstan and meet a culture that has become both famous and controversial in the debate over when humans really learned to live with horses. The Botai. The Botai lived around 5,500 years ago in what is now northern Kazakhstan. On paper, they don't look like the kind of people who would rewrite world history. No palaces, no writing, no cities, just small villages on the steppe, clusters of semi-subterranean houses, storage pits, hearths, trash dumps. But under their floors, in their pots and across the surrounding hills, archaeologists found something extraordinary. Bones, horse bones, almost nothing but horse bones. At some Botai sites, more than 90% of the animal remains are from horses. Not a mixed herd of sheep, goats, cattle, and the occasional wild mare. Just horses, in staggering numbers, and spread across generations. Whatever these people were doing, horses weren't a side dish. They were the main event. The earliest excavators looked at those piles of bones and saw hunters specializing in a single prey species. A steppe equivalent of Paleolithic reindeer hunters. Efficient, focused, but still essentially wild in their relationship with the herds. Then more clues started to surface. On the edges of Botai settlements, archaeologists identified what looked like enclosures, areas of heavily trampled ground, rich in phosphate, with chemical signatures that match accumulated manure. Soil churned in a way that suggests hooves pacing over the same confined space again and again. Corals, or something very much like them. Inside the houses, pottery sherds told another piece of the story. When scientists analysed the microscopic fat residues soaked into those vessels, they found a distinctive pattern of lipids, fatty acids, that match horse milk rather than horse meat. Not just any horse milk, but mare's milk. Enough of it, in enough different pots, to suggest this wasn't a one-off experiment. It looked like regular milking of live animals. Now the picture was shifting. Corals, massive numbers of horses, chemical traces of mare's milk. This started to look less like a people who occasionally brought down a wild herd, and more like a community living off animals. They kept close, controlled, and used over time. Then came the teeth. Several Botai horse skulls showed unusual wear on the premolars, polished facets and small lesions that some researchers argued could only be explained by a bit, some kind of rope, leather, or even bone passing repeatedly over the same spot in the mouth. If that interpretation was right, it meant something momentous. Not only were the Botai milking horses, they were probably riding them or using them to pull loads. Milk, corrals, bitware, overwhelming numbers of horse bones. For a while, Botai looked like the smoking gun everyone had been waiting for, the earliest clear horse herding culture, maybe the birthplace of the domestic horse as we know it. Textbooks and documentaries began to say it outright. Horses were first domesticated at Botai. But science is rarely that simple, and the Botai story did not stay settled for long. As more specialists examined the teeth, some were less convinced. Couldn't certain kinds of natural grit or particular grazing patterns produce similar wear? If a few animals had been briefly tamed and fitted with simple headgear in an otherwise wild population, would the dental traces look any different from those in a fully managed domestic herd? Others pointed out that even if the bitwear was real, it didn't tell us how common riding was or how central it was to Botai life. A handful of ridden animals could coexist with a much larger herd kept mainly for meat and milk. Then ancient DNA walked into the argument and quietly upended the table. When geneticists extracted and sequenced DNA from Botai horse bones, they expected to find ancestors of modern domestic horses. The source herd, the root of the family tree. Instead, they found something stranger. Botai horses were closely related not to the horses we ride today, but to a different population, the animals now known as Przewalski's horses, the stocky, dun-coloured horses that survive in small numbers in Mongolia. For a long time, Przewalski's horses were thought to be the last wild horse. The Botai genetics suggested almost the opposite, that these so-called wild horses might actually be the feral descendants of a managed Botai population. Even more striking, modern domestic horses, the ones pulling carts in the Bronze Age and running in racetracks now, do not seem to come from the Botai line at all. Their closest ancestral signatures point elsewhere, to later events on the Eurasian steppe. This doesn't erase what the Botai were doing. The evidence for corrals, for intensive use of horses, for mare's milk in pottery, still stands and is widely accepted. Most researchers agree that by Botai times, humans in that region were managing horse herds on a scale far beyond casual hunting. They were, at the very least, herders, and quite possibly milking specialists, maybe with some riding on the side. What's more contested is the nature and fate of their horses. Were they truly domesticated in the full genetic sense, animals whose breeding was consistently controlled by humans over many generations? Or were they part of a powerful, regionally important experiment in horse management that ultimately got replaced by a different domestication centre further west? And those bit-worn teeth, some still see them as early riding gear. Others remain cautious, arguing that without clear associated equipment, cheek pieces, harness parts, the case isn't closed. So where does that leave us? Botai now occupies a strange, fascinating place in the story. Not the straightforward first domestic horse chapter many hoped for, but a window into how complex and fragile early domestication experiments can be. One cluster of villages in one stretch of steppe, showing us that people were corralling horses, milking them, and perhaps climbing onto their backs thousands of years before the classic age of chariots and cavalry. The details of what exactly they invented, and how their legacy fed into later traditions, are still being argued paper by paper, lab by lab. But the impact of the discovery is already clear. A modest set of sites in northern Kazakhstan forced archaeologists and geneticists to redraw world maps of domestication. It showed that even if the horses we ride today don't trace their main ancestry to Botai, humans and horses were already bound together there in a deep, demanding partnership. And if one such experiment could rise, flourish, and then be genetically sidelined, it raises an unsettling possibility. How many other early horse cultures flickered into being, left faint traces in the ground, and vanished before their lines could shape the animals we know? To follow that thread, we have to leave Botai behind and look for the lineage that did win out, the horse population whose genes swept across continents and into almost every barn on Earth. If Botai horses aren't the main ancestors of the animals we know today, then where did our modern domestic horses actually come from? To answer that, we have to move from bones and pottery to something even more ghostly. Fragments of DNA hiding in ancient horse teeth and long-buried bones. Ancient DNA is a strange kind of witness. It doesn't show you saddles or bits or how a horse moved under a rider. It won't tell you whether someone whispered to a nervous mare or whether a herd was sacred to a particular clan. What it does is colder and simpler. It counts differences. It measures relatedness. When scientists sequence DNA from ancient horses and compare it to that of modern breeds, they can't see the first ride, but they can see which populations left lots of descendants and which were evolutionary dead ends. They can see when a certain genetic style of horse suddenly explodes in numbers, spreading across thousands of kilometres in just a few hundred years. And in the case of modern domestic horses, that is exactly what the data suggest. Somewhere around 4,200 to 4,600 years ago, a particular horse population, genetically distinct from the Botai line, seems to burst onto the scene in Western Eurasia. Before that, the genetic map of horses looks like a patchwork. many regional wild populations, each with their own local history. After that moment, one lineage starts to dominate, showing up again and again in skeletons from the steppe, from Europe, from the Near East. Many researchers now point toward the western steppe region around the lower Volga and Don rivers, roughly in today's southern Russia, as a strong candidate for this turning point. Not the only place humans interacted with horses, but the place where a particular, highly successful stock seems to have been refined and then spread. These animals carry the closest genetic signatures to the majority of modern domestic horses. But it doesn't look like a single village, a single day, a single eureka, we have domestication moment. Instead, the DNA tells a story of process. First, a long period where humans across the steppe were interacting with different horse populations, hunting them, perhaps loosely managing herds, maybe capturing and riding occasional animals. Local wild mares and stallions had their own genetic flavours, adapted to specific climates and grasses. Then, at some point, people in that western steppe zone began consistently favouring a certain type of horse. Maybe they liked animals that were calmer around corrals. Maybe they valued endurance over short bursts of speed. Maybe they preferred horses that tolerated harness and bit, that didn't panic when surrounded by other animals or driven into unfamiliar terrain. Once people start making choices like that, deciding which stallions are allowed to breed, which mares are kept in the herd, which foals are raised and which are quietly slaughtered, evolution speeds up. What natural selection would do slowly over many thousands of years, human selection can compress into centuries. Temperament can change fast under this pressure. Foxes in famous farm experiments went from wary and aggressive to dog-like and friendly in just a few dozen generations, simply because breeders kept picking the tamest individuals. Body shape follows similar rules: select for stronger backs and certain leg proportions, and within a surprisingly short time you can end up with animals visibly different from their wild cousins, more compact, more uniform, built to carry weight or pull loads rather than only to flee predators. The ancient DNA suggests that exactly this kind of directional selection happened to that western steppe population. Their genetic profile begins to dominate, while many other local horse lines fade out or are swamped. But genes don't move on their own. They hitchhike inside living animals, and those animals move because people do. This is where trade, raiding, and exchange come in. A fast, steady, reliable horse is valuable in almost any society that has discovered what horses can do. Once a few groups on the steppe had access to especially useful animals, their neighbours had choices. They could steal them, trade for them, marry into families that owned them, or capture their mares and breed them with locally caught stallions. Every stolen mare, every gifted stallion, every captured herd leader was a packet of genes changing the future. Horses taken as war booty might be bred far from their home pastures. Animals exchanged along caravan routes could carry that same successful lineage west into Europe, south toward Mesopotamia, east across the steppe belt toward Central Asia and beyond. Archaeology and genetics together trace this spread, but neither is complete alone. From the ground we see shifts in horse bones at burial and settlement sites, more consistent sizes, changes in age profiles that suggest managed breeding rather than random hunting, and increasing evidence of harness and vehicle use. In the DNA we see a parallel pattern, the rise of that single dominant lineage, pushing aside or absorbing local wild populations as it goes. Put together they outline a quiet revolution. Not a single heroic inventor, but many generations of herders, raiders, traders, and riders gradually reshaping a wild animal into something new, and then sending that new kind of horse rippling across whole continents. It's important to keep some humility here. The data are still coming in. New ancient genomes can nudge timelines forward or backward, or highlight regions that were more important than anyone realized. No one can yet point to a single valley, a single campfire circle, and say, "Here, on this night, the domestic horse was born." But the broad picture is getting clearer. Modern domestic horses seem to descend mainly from a particular steppe population that rose to prominence about 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. Human choices, who to breed, who to keep, who to ride, who to sell, acted like a powerful filter, amplifying that lineage until it drowned out many others. And the mechanisms that spread those genes weren't gentle academic exchanges. They were the realities of life on the steppe: trade partnerships, political alliances, rustling, warfare. By the time we see chariots flashing across Bronze Age battlefields, that genetic revolution is already well underway. The horses pulling those vehicles are not just any horses. They are the descendants of centuries of quiet selection and restless movement, carrying in their cells the signature of a particular human-made lineage that had learned how to thrive under saddles and yokes. To see how that new type of horse transformed human travel itself, how walking stopped being the default and riding became an option, we have to follow those animals from the breeding grounds of the steppe onto the backs of the first riders. Imagine being one of those early steppe herders in a world where the default speed of life is the speed of your own feet. Every journey is a calculation. How far can we go before the children tire, before the old woman's knees give out, before we're too far from water to walk back? Scouts can only range so many miles from camp before nightfall. A distant patch of spring grass or a salt lick might as well be on the moon if it takes 2 days to reach and 2 days to return. Now picture something different. You swing yourself, a little clumsily, onto the back of a compact, sturdy mare. At first you just sit while someone leads her by a rope. Then one day you press your heels in, lean forward, and she moves. A walk, then a jog, then that strange 4-beat rhythm that eats distance in chunks your ancestors never imagined. In a single afternoon, you can scout what used to take a day and a half on foot. You can circle a herd that would once have outrun you in minutes. You can leave camp at dawn, reach a far waterhole by midday, and be home before the cooking fires are lit. Riding, even in its clumsy early forms, doesn't just add speed. It explodes the radius of what counts as nearby. A rider can check on distant grazing, look for rival camps, or follow migrating herds far beyond the horizon and still make it back with news while it's useful. That means fewer nasty surprises, fewer herds lost to sudden storms because nobody saw the clouds building, fewer enemies arriving unannounced because no one was watching the approaches. It also means new options for the animals themselves. Mounted herders can push their horses or cattle or sheep into rougher, more scattered pasture and still keep control. They can shadow wild bands, drift with them, peel off foals and mares and bring them back to camp. The line between wild herd and managed stock gets blurrier, and human influence reaches farther into the landscape. The trouble is, bones don't tell stories that cleanly. Archaeologists sometimes point to changes in human skeletons and say, maybe riders lived here. Certain patterns of wear in the hips, spine, and upper legs have been linked to long-term riding in later, better documented horse cultures. There are even skeletons from the steppe with damage that looks like what repeated falls or jolting in the saddle might cause. But this evidence is slippery. The same kinds of stresses can come from other behaviours: heavy load carrying, repetitive squatting, long-distance walking. Bodies are adaptable, but they're also vague. A spine that looks like a rider's in one population might just reflect a lifetime of hauling water or firewood in another. So physical anthropology can raise the possibility of riding, but it rarely gives us a dramatic, courtroom-level confirmation. It whispers maybe, not definitely. That's why researchers also look for indirect clues in the gear. Before the familiar high saddle with stirrups, people had to make do with much simpler solutions. A folded hide thrown over the back, a pad stuffed with hair or grass, lashed in place with a belly strap. Maybe a simple surcingle, just a strap around the horse's body that let the rider grip something more reliable than sweaty hair and skin. Early bits might have been nothing more than a leather thong across the mouth, or a rope noseband that gave some steering without cutting into the gums. Bone and metal bits show up later. The first riders may well have been using entirely organic equipment that has long since rotted away, leaving no trace in the ground. Even without sophisticated tack, the basic transformation had begun. Once you can ride at all, even awkwardly, the world rearranges itself. Seasonal movements start to stretch. Camps that once moved a few days' walk between winter and summer pastures can now leapfrog much farther, chasing better grass or escaping drought. Springs, marshes and mineral licks far out on the steppe, once visited rarely if at all, become part of a regular yearly circuit. Over time, those circuits can harden into routes, traditional paths that families or clans follow generation after generation. A certain ridge becomes the place we always cross in spring. A particular river bend is where the horses foal when the snow melts. Riding doesn't just speed people up, it inscribes patterns into the landscape. And as those patterns form, something else changes. People themselves. Not everyone in an early horse-using society is going to spend their days on horseback. Someone has to tend the fires, watch the children, work the hides, grind the grain. Someone has to walk alongside loaded pack animals, lead colts, drive slower herds. So a new distinction begins to emerge, even if nobody names it yet. There are people who ride, and people who mostly walk. Maybe at first it's just the most skilled herders, the best hunters, the young men and women chosen to scout or to rush messages between camps. Age, gender, status, and sheer physical ability all play a part. A broken leg that once meant lifelong slowness might now mean lifelong exclusion from the fastest part of community life. Access to speed becomes a kind of quiet privilege. If you can ride, your social world is larger. You can visit distant allies, join raids, see new grazing grounds with your own eyes. If you mostly walk, your world shrinks to the pace of your feet, even as the group's overall territory expands. That gap between those who move quickly and those who move slowly will widen over the centuries. It will shape who commands and who obeys, whose news arrives first, whose gods travel farthest. And horses are only half of that story, because just as riders are learning to balance on padded backs with simple straps and nosebands, another idea is taking shape in workshops and wagon yards, the wheel. When someone finally yokes that spinning circle of wood to this new, fast, resilient animal, the revolution of riding will meet the revolution of rolling. That collision, horse and wheel together, will remake war, trade, and the map of the ancient world. At first, the wheel is slow, heavy solid discs of wood nailed to clumsy axles. Carts pulled by cattle that plod, unbothered by urgency. Good for grain, firewood, and the long, patient work of farming. Not good for speed, not good for shock. To turn the wheel into a weapon, people had to solve a string of problems that, for tens of thousands of years, nobody had even known existed. You need a wheel that's light enough to move fast, but strong enough not to shatter the first time it hits a rock. That leads to spoked wheels, delicate-looking skeletons of wood, perfected through endless trial and error. You need an axle that can take the strain without snapping, a body that distributes weight, a way to harness animals so their power flows cleanly into motion instead of sideways into chaos. And then you need the right animal. Cattle are strong, but slow. Onager and wild ass are fast but mean, hard to tame, and prone to doing whatever they feel like at exactly the wrong moment. Horses, especially the smaller, tougher steppe types, sit in a sweet spot. Quick off the mark, able to pull at speed, responsive enough eventually to accept the weirdness of a light box rattling behind them. None of this happens overnight. Somewhere in the late 3rd to early 2nd millennium BCE, across the Eurasian world, you start to see the pieces line up. Better woodworking, stronger bronzes for fittings and hubs, leather, working refined enough to create harness systems that don't strangle the animals or tear them apart at full gallop. Put it all together and you get something the world has never seen before. A vehicle built not for carrying heavy loads slowly, but for moving a small number of people very, very fast. A war chariot. If early riding was an invisible revolution, noisy hooves, quiet archaeology chariot warfare is the opposite. It explodes into the historical record with a kind of theatrical violence. Clay tablets and carved reliefs start talking about elite chariot warriors. Myths remember gods thundering across the sky in gleaming cars. Royal tombs swallow up elaborate vehicles, teams of carefully killed horses laid out like offerings to speed the dead into whatever comes next. On the battlefield, a chariot is part weapon, part stage. A light, two-wheeled car, often with a driver and a warrior, maybe a shield-bearer. The horses hit a trot, then a gallop. The spoked wheels bite into packed earth, and suddenly you have a moving platform from which to throw javelins, shoot arrows, or simply terrify the people on foot in front of you. In some places, chariots don't actually crash headlong into infantry lines, the way later paintings like to imagine. They wheel, they circle, they send shafts of arrows into dense formations, then dart away before anyone can grab them. In other traditions they do charge, slamming into less organised enemies, breaking their nerve, if not always their bones. But always they are meant to be seen. Chariots are loud, expensive, complicated things. To field even a small force of them, a kingdom needs herds of suitable horses, fodder to keep them alive, artisans who can build and repair wheels and axles, leather workers to maintain harnesses, grooms and drivers and trainers who know not just how to handle horses, but how to make them pull in formation, under stress, in dust and blood and noise. Behind every chariot on the field is an invisible trail of specialized labor, stretching back years. Foals selected for temperament and build, young horses paired, trained together until their gaits match, until they learn not to panic when a partner stumbles. Workshops turning out bronze fittings, wheel rims and linchpins. Scribes and officials tracking rations of grain and hay, assigning stable hands, counting and recounting the teams before campaign season begins. This isn't something a small village can improvise. Chariotry is statecraft in wooden and bronze form. That's part of why it spreads the way it does. Once one polity unveils a corps of chariots, a new fast arm of the military, its neighbours have choices. Get crushed, get clever, or get their own. Victorious King's Parade captured chariots and horses home as trophies. Foreign craftsmen are carried off, resettled, ordered to replicate their old masters' magic for new lords. Treaties begin to mention chariots and horses as prestigious gifts. I send you fine chariot teams, you send me lapis and gold. Diplomatic marriages include the transfer of driving and training knowledge. When a royal daughter marries abroad, she may arrive with a retinue that includes charioteers and grooms who quietly seed the host kingdom's stables with new techniques. Imitation, theft, and forced migration turn chariotry into a kind of Bronze Age franchise model. And while chariots are instruments of war, they are also walking, rolling billboards for hierarchy. Who gets to ride in them? Not common soldiers, not field hands. In many societies, chariots are the property of kings, princes, and a narrow warrior elite. Lists of ranks literally begin with those who stand on a chariot, Ceremonial processions put chariots at the front, under fancy canopies, their horses dripping with decorated harness, while everyone else walks. Appearing in a chariot says, without words, I command enough people, enough land, enough surplus food to support this absurdly expensive machine and the animals that power it. My authority is backed not just by personal courage, but by a logistical machine that can put wheels and hooves onto any battlefield I choose. Different regions tune the basic idea to their own needs. In parts of the Near East, light, fast chariots become mobile archer platforms, showering arrows over slow-moving troops. In the Aegean and some parts of Anatolia, heavier vehicles sometimes function more as elite taxis, delivering nobles to the fight, then letting them dismount to battle on foot. In India and China, complex chariot traditions evolve with their own tactical uses, ceremonial roles, and mythic echoes. But everywhere the pattern is the same. For a few centuries, the fusion of horse and wheel defines what it means to wage serious war and to be truly elite. And then, gradually, the shine begins to dull. Better riding techniques, stronger horses, improved saddles, and eventually new forms of cavalry change the equation. Rougher terrain, shifting tactics, and the sheer cost of maintaining chariot corps make them less attractive in many regions. Infantry with better discipline and better weapons learn how to blunt their impact. In some places, chariots retreat to parades and rituals. In others, they vanish almost entirely. But for a crucial window in the Bronze Age, they are the cutting edge, a speed upgrade so dramatic that it rewires how states think about distance, power, and prestige. And they set the stage for the next transformation, when the rider himself, not the wheeled box behind him, becomes the primary weapon. When the wheeled box fades a little into the background, the animal that pulls it steps fully into view. By the late Bronze Age, across Egypt and the Near East, the horse is no longer just a chariot engine. It's a political actor with 4 legs. Rulers talk about horses the way modern states talk about fighter jets and nuclear submarines. Not just as weapons, but as statements. Owning the right kind of horses in the right numbers from the right bloodlines says something about who you are and how seriously other people should take you. We catch this most clearly in the letters. In the 14th century BCE, kings from Egypt, Babylon, Hatti, Mitanni, and smaller states wrote to each other on clay tablets that archaeologists later found at places like Amarna. These letters are full of flattery, complaints, and bargaining, but again and again horses trot through the text. I send you fine horses. Why have you not sent me horses worthy of a great king? A pharaoh grumbles that a supposed brother king has sent him animals of poor quality, or fewer teams than promised. Another ruler boasts that his horses are so well trained that they never tire, that their chariots never lag in battle. The message behind the words is simple. Proper kings possess proper horses. If you can't field them, maybe you don't really belong at the grown-ups' table. To live up to that expectation, states have to build something new, permanent horse infrastructures. We see hints of this in Egyptian records. There are royal stables attached to palaces, lists of grooms and overseers of the horse, inventories of chariot teams and their equipment. Some reliefs show long rows of horses being led by handlers, or scenes that look suspiciously like training drills. Pairs stepping in sync, drivers holding tight reins, wheels aligned like beads on a string. You don't get that level of coordination by accident. Somewhere behind the stone carvings is the daily grind, stable yards that reek of hay and manure, scribes counting out barley rations, officials tracking which horses are fit for campaign season and which are breeding stock. There are people whose entire careers depend on keeping elite animals healthy, responsive, and ready to move on a king's timetable, not their own. And just as important as the animals are the humans who understand them, When one great king sends horses as a gift, he often sends trainers and chariot drivers too. Letters don't always spell this out, but diplomatic marriages and captured specialists quietly move expertise across borders. A princess from a horse-rich kingdom marries into a court that's weaker in that department. She arrives with a little entourage, grooms who know how to feed and condition horses for long campaigns, drivers who can teach new recruits how to keep a team steady at speed, maybe even a veterinarian priest with rituals and remedies for sick animals. After a war, the flow reverses. Victorious rulers sometimes resettle captured chariot corps and their staff, using them as the seed stock of new stables. You're not just importing horsepower, you're importing know-how, training schedules, breeding ideas, harness tricks, the accumulated craft that turns an anxious prey animal into a steady partner in combat or ceremony. This knowledge turns horses into more than battlefield tools. They become arteries of empire. Once you have reliable horse teams, messages stop crawling and start flying. In the Nile Valley or along the great river routes of Mesopotamia, scribes can now send urgent orders, not just by boat or plodding courier, but by mounted rider or light chariot. Garrisons on distant frontiers receive news of rebellions or invasions days, even weeks, faster than they would on foot. Patrols can sweep stretches of desert or steppe that would be effectively unreachable for infantry alone. A king who controls good horses and the roads they run on can project his presence far beyond the line of sight. His words reach fortresses and provincial governors before rumour does. His ability to respond to threats begins to outrun the threats themselves. But there's a catch, several actually. Horses are expensive. A well-run stable devours grain, water, and labour. It requires land that isn't growing food for people. Bronze fittings, leather harness, chariot parts, replacement animals when the old ones break down. These are all drawn from the same surplus that has to feed bureaucrats, pay soldiers, and fund monuments. So rulers live with a constant tension. On clay tablets and temple walls they celebrate sleek horses and glittering chariots. They boast of hundreds of teams and thousands of mounts. In reality, they still rely on massed infantry, tens of thousands of men on foot, to hold lines, garrison cities, build siege works, and absorb casualties. The horses are the edge, not the bulk. They're what you send to chase down raiders, to harry a retreating enemy, to guard a royal person surrounded by bodyguards. The foot soldiers are what you use to actually take and keep ground, to storm walls, to dig trenches, to stand for long hours in the sun while the king's horses rest in the shade. Art and texts reveal how people felt about this imbalance. Common soldiers in many records are just numbers. 5,000 men, 10,000 spearmen, horses and their drivers get names. They're carved in fine detail, reins, plumes and muscles, carefully rendered, while the infantry below are a repeated pattern of helmets and shields. Titles like Master of Horse or Chief of Chariot Warriors rank alongside high officials of the court. Royal inscriptions linger over the behaviour of horses in battle, how they snorted like lions, how they did not turn back, even when arrows fell like rain. Stories of victories sometimes single out a brave driver or a reliable team, as if the animals themselves carry a portion of the glory. You can feel the status hierarchy written into the stone. To be close to horses is to be close to power. To command them, to train them, to ride or drive them in the king's service is to occupy a tier of society that looks sideways at the mass of men with spears. And yet the horse is still an animal, temperamental, fragile, mortal. States pour attention and reverence into these creatures because they know how much rides on them. A plague that sweeps through equine populations is a strategic disaster. A bad year for fodder can cripple mobility. A king whose horse corps collapses risks more than embarrassment. he risks losing the ability to move faster than his enemies. In the background of every stele showing a triumphant pharaoh or great king thundering past his foes is this quiet anxiety, the understanding that his reach, his speed, his very image as a world ruler depends on creatures that can at any moment stumble. The solution over the next centuries will not be to give up on horses, but to change how humans sit on them, shifting the centre of gravity from the chariot box to the rider's body. And out on the grasslands beyond the settled kingdoms, people who grow up among herds will push that change farther than any palace scribe can yet imagine. Out on those grasslands, the horse is no longer a luxury strapped to a wooden frame. It's the centre of gravity for an entire way of life. If you could fly over the old world in the late Bronze and early Iron Ages and turn everything else transparent, the rivers, the forests, the mountain chains, you'd see something surprising. Running from Hungary through Ukraine, across Kazakhstan, all the way to Mongolia and northern China, there's this immense pale belt. A band of grass and open country stretching halfway around Eurasia. Ecologists call it the steppe. To a horse it might as well be paradise. No dense forests to tangle legs, few steep slopes to break ankles. Just rolling ground, seasonal water and grass, oceans of it changing colour with the year. It's not gentle. Winters can be brutal. Summers can burn. But for a tough grazing animal that can dig through snow with its hooves and move on when things get sparse, it's an invitation. Most crops hate this kind of landscape. The soils are patchy. Rainfall is erratic. Farming, in the way river valleys know it, is a risky bet. But horses, cattle and sheep, they can turn wild grass into meat, milk, hides and muscle. So instead of fields, you get herds. Instead of villages, you get camps that can fold up in an afternoon and be 20 miles away by nightfall. This is pastoral nomadism, not aimless wandering, but a yearly rhythm. Families move with their animals along known routes, following fresh pasture, avoiding places grazed too hard, circling back to favoured wintering grounds. A good herder knows not just the land, but its timing, the week when a certain valley will bloom, the usual date when snow starts to crust too hard for foals to pour through. In this world, herds are not background scenery, they are stored wealth. Every mare and foal is a line in an unwritten ledger. Horses are dowries, blood price, emergency rations, and transport all at once. Lose a grain harvest, and a farmer starves. Lose part of a herd, and a nomad bleeds capital. That shapes strategy. If your wealth has legs, your settlement pattern changes. You don't pour labour into walls and irrigation canals. You invest in knowledge of routes, alliances over grazing rights, backup camps, if the first choice fails. Mobility stops being a side benefit and becomes the main defence. If trouble comes, you don't always stand and fight. You vanish. You split herds in different directions. Families disperse. To an outsider used to sieges and fortresses, it can feel like trying to punch smoke. You hit one camp and find only a few animals and old fire pits. The rest of the wealth is already days away, walking on its own four hooves. That same mobility turned outward becomes a weapon, mounted raiding at first with simple weapons, later with terrifying sophistication, lets small groups strike deep, fast, and then melt into distances that infantry can't easily cross. You can hit caravans, border farms, even lightly guarded royal estates, then be over the horizon by the time anyone organises a response. As steppe peoples refine horsemanship, something else happens. The rider stops being just a passenger and turns into an integrated part of a moving weapons system. The composite bow, layers of wood, horn and sinew glued together, emerges as one of the great steppe inventions. Short, powerful and efficient. It's perfectly sized for use from horseback. A skilled archer can loose arrow after arrow, while the horse is still at a fast trot, sometimes even twisting backwards to shoot while pretending to flee. Add remounts to that picture, each rider not on one exhausted animal, but with a string of spare horses, and you get a force that can move farther, faster, and in stranger patterns than most agrarian armies can even imagine. Endurance is the quiet multiplier in all this. A single horse can sprint, but a carefully managed herd of remounts can keep you going all day, day after day, without burning out your best animals. A cavalryman from a settled kingdom might have one mount. A seasoned steppe rider could rotate through several in a single campaign. Where infantry need rest and supply lines, a mobile band can live off mares' milk, meat, and what they carry, outrunning not just pursuers, but news of their own approach. It's tempting from the outside to compress all this into a single stereotype, the nomad, as if Scythians, Saka, Xiongnu, Huns, Turks, and later Mongols were interchangeable horse archer clones. The reality is messier and more interesting. Some steppe groups lean heavily on horses, others balance them with sheep, goats, or cattle. Some build hierarchical confederations with formal titles and elaborate rituals. Others stay in looser, kin-based bands. Some raid constantly. Others prefer trading, guiding caravans, or hiring out as mercenaries. They don't live in a timeless, empty wilderness either. For millennia, the steppe is a conduit between worlds. Ideas, metals, diseases, languages, and bloodlines flow along the same grazing routes as herds. Iranian-speaking nomads carry motifs and myths that end up in Greek art. Turkic and Mongolic groups later transmit techniques and technologies between China, the Islamic world, and Europe. A style of saddle, a new kind of bit. A better bow design can leap thousands of miles because people and horses are already accustomed to moving that far. To farmers in walled cities, the grasslands beyond the horizon can look like a threatening blank space on the map. But from inside, that space is a woven network of paths, seasonal camps, alliances, and rivalries, a living road system made of memory and hoofbeats. Horses don't just survive in that system, they define it. And in doing so, they teach humans something that will echo into every later empire on land. Speed is not only how fast you can move, it's how hard it is for anyone else to make you stop. Next, as saddles and eventually stirrups spread along these horse roads, that lesson will be sharpened into a new way of sitting on power itself. If you've ever tried to sit bareback on a moving horse, you know something very basic about physics and anatomy. Your thighs burn, your lower back complains. The horse's spine feels like a living balance beam trying to shrug you off. Every change in speed, every sideways step, ripples straight through your body. Now stretch that not over a 10-minute joyride, but over hours, over days, over a campaign season. That, in slow motion, is why saddles matter. A saddle is not just a cushion, it's a weight distribution device. A good saddle spreads a rider's mass along the horse's back, away from the fragile spine and onto the stronger muscles and ribs. That means less chafing, fewer sores, and a horse that can carry a human for longer without breaking down. For the rider, it's a brace. Instead of clenching your legs non-stop to stay on, you can sit into a structure. The horn, the cantle, the raised front and back, different cultures emphasize different parts, but the effect is similar. Sudden stops, tight turns, a burst into gallop. The saddle absorbs some of that chaos. You can free your hands for weapons, tools, reins, or just not falling. Early saddles on the steppe were probably little more than padded cloth and leather, stuffed with hair or felt tied in place with girths and breast straps. Over time, wooden or horn, trees developed. internal frames that kept weight evenly distributed and created those distinct high fronts and backs you see in later steppe and medieval saddles. Each tweak did two things at once. It made life easier for the horse, and it turned the rider more and more into a stable firing platform. From there, it's an easy story to tell yourself. You imagine some nameless genius hammering metal into the first stirrups. You picture a lone invention spreading like wildfire, and suddenly boom, heavy cavalry, knights, feudalism. Horses reshaping Europe in one brilliant leap. Real history is slower and less obedient. Stirrups, loops or frames you put your feet into do change what's possible on horseback. They give you extra points of contact. You can stand slightly in the saddle to absorb shocks. You can rise to shoot or strike, sit back down to turn, then brace again for impact. Mounted archers benefit. A rider can half stand at the moment of release, letting the legs, not the spine, take the jolt. Lancers benefit. With strong stirrups and a good saddle tree, you can couch a spear or lance under your arm and let the horse's momentum drive it. But stirrups don't grant superpowers automatically. If your horse is small, your saddle flimsy, your training poor, and your formation loose, iron rings hanging by your knees will not magically turn you into a battlefield tank. They're an amplifier, not a cause. The famous idea that the stirrup created feudalism, once popular in some history books, looks, from modern scholarship, a lot like a story told backwards. There are wealthy landowners, armoured elites, complex webs of obligation, mounted retainers, and heavy cavalry traditions in various places long before stirrups arrive or become widespread. There are also societies with excellent stirrup technology that never develop European-style feudalism at all. Japan has stirrups and horse warriors, but a rather different political structure. Parts of India adopt advanced saddles and stirrups into worlds with kings, courts and city-states that don't look much like medieval France. In the Islamic world, high-backed saddles and paired stirrups help produce formidable cavalry, but they plug into already sophisticated state systems. The pattern isn't one gadget, one revolution. It's incremental layers. Saddle design changing slowly as people notice where horses get sore. Bits evolving from simple rawhide or bone to metal mouthpieces with more nuanced control. Breeding programs quietly selecting for backs that fit certain saddles. Temperaments that stay calm under the strange pressures of battle. Training regimes teaching riders how to mount, dismount, fire, charge, wheel and retreat as one moving organism. Tactics adapt too. Light horse archers on the steppe make one kind of sense: speed, skirmishing, hit and run. Put similar saddles and stirrups onto larger horses in more enclosed terrain, and you start to see shock charges, armoured riders slamming into infantry lines. Even then, the timetable stutters. Chinese armies have forms of stirrup centuries before they become standard in the Mediterranean. Steppe groups experiment with different types, some emphasizing stability for archery, others for close combat. In Europe, the classic high-front, high-back war saddle that locks a rider in for a lance charge doesn't appear overnight. It accretes over generations of leatherworkers, tweaking shapes and woodworkers refining trees. Same basic toolkit, different landscapes, economies and enemies. Different outcomes. A border garrison on the frontier of the Roman Empire might adopt a new saddle style to better patrol rough ground. A steppe confederation might favour designs that suit long-distance riding and rapid dismounts. A Japanese samurai class turns stirrups and saddles toward archery duels, then later toward heavier melee combat. So when we talk about saddles and stirrups, it's tempting to look for a single turning point, a night when someone hammered a strip of iron, hung it from a leather strap, and changed the world. The reality is gentler and, in some ways, more unsettling. Power doesn't usually arrive with fanfare, it accumulates. A little more padding here, a better strap arrangement there, a tweak in breeding, a new drill, a revised formation. And then slowly the relationship between human and horse, and between rider and everyone on foot, tilts. Not because of one brilliant invention, but because of centuries of small adjustments all pulling in the same direction, until sitting on a horse isn't just a way to travel. It's a different way to inhabit the landscape, to fight, to govern, to imagine what a single mounted human can do. And as we move into the classical world, into Greek battlefields, Roman roads and rising empires, you'll see how those quiet changes in tack and training start to map directly onto changes in status, citizenship, and who gets to count as a full participant in the life of the state. By the time we reach the Greek city-states, the horse is no longer just a clever tool. It's a social filter if you stand on a low hill and look down at a classical Greek battlefield in your mind. The first thing you notice is not cavalry. It's a forest of spears, phalanxes, dense blocks of heavy infantry, shield to shield, spears angled forward, grinding their way across the field. The hoplite, the idealized citizen soldier, fights on foot. His status is tied to his place in that wall of bronze and wood, and yet at the edges of that vision there are horses. In early Greek warfare, cavalry is often light, more about harassment and pursuit than decisive shock. Riders screen the flanks, chase down fleeing enemies, raid supply lines, throw javelins from a distance. They are, in doctrine, secondary, but they are not secondary in status. Owning and maintaining a warhorse in a Greek polis is a serious ongoing expense. It is not just the animal, it is feed, stable space, tack, a groom or two, time for training. In many city-states, only the wealthiest citizens qualify as hippies, literally the horsemen. The word for your political class is the word for your mount. Below them are the hoplites, solid, respectable property-owning infantry. Below that, poorer citizens who serve as light troops or rowers. The slope from horse to foot is not just tactical. It is economic, it is legal. It shapes who is expected to lead and who is expected to follow. Over time, doctrine nudges this hierarchy around. As warfare between Greek states becomes more professional, as generals experiment, cavalry starts to matter more. Thessaly, with its rich plains, develops a reputation for excellent horsemen. In Macedon under Philip, and then Alexander, cavalry becomes the cutting edge of an entirely new style of war. Alexander's famous companion cavalry are not simply fast movers. They are armoured, disciplined, drilled for coordinated charges. Infantry pins the enemy in place. The companions hit like a hammer. Shock tactics, once rare, become central. This is not an accident of personality alone. It grows out of a landscape where horses can be bred and fed in number, out of a court culture that can support permanent elite riders, out of a long history of small adjustments in saddles, bits and training that make those charges survivable for both horse and human. When Alexander's armies roll east, their horses carry more than spear points. They carry a way of organising society in layers of mobility and privilege. Rome watches all of this, adapts, and then does something different. In early Rome, equites, the equestrian order, are literally the citizens rich enough for horse service. Like the Greek hippies, they form a cavalry arm in the early Republic. They also form a census class. How many horses you can afford is a proxy for how much weight your voice carries. But as the Republic expands, the Roman army professionalizes and changes its mix. Legions of heavy infantry become the backbone of Roman warfare. Auxiliary troops from allied or conquered peoples provide much of the cavalry. The equites, the horsemen, gradually step down from their saddles and move into offices. By the late Republic and early Empire, being an equestrian is no longer mainly about riding in battle. It is an administrative rank. The equestrian order supplies tax contractors, provincial governors, financial officials. A horse on your early census record has become a path into the machinery of the state. The animal that once marked you as a battlefield elite now marks you as part of an imperial bureaucracy. Even off the battlefield, horses and empire become entangled. Roman roads are famous for their straightness and their endurance, slabs of stone stretching across continents. But what makes them truly powerful is not stone alone. It is stone plus hooves. Along those roads the state maintains posting stations. Fresh horses, grooms, sometimes modest lodgings. A relay rider carrying an imperial message can change mounts repeatedly in a single day, compressing weeks of travel into days, days into hours. Orders flow from Rome to a distant frontier, faster than any human on foot could dream of. Reports flow back, governors, couriers, tax revenues, grain shipments, all move in rhythms set by what a horse can endure between stops. The empire's sense of distance shrinks to match the speed of a cantering mount on good stone. But the system has edges. Horses eat a lot. A single warhorse can require several times the daily fodder of a human. Grain, hay, pasture, all of it must be grown, gathered, transported. In lean years, cavalry is expensive in a very literal, stomach-level way. They also sicken. Epizootic diseases, fast-moving outbreaks among animals, can ripple through remount herds and wagon teams, suddenly slowing armies and messengers alike. Parasites, hoof infections, respiratory illness, all the quiet biological constraints behind the show of power. Terrain pushes back too. Roman cavalry is less at home in dense forests, steep mountains, or swamps. In some provinces, mules and donkeys, not sleek warhorses, are the real logistical backbone. The shining image of the equestrian elite rides atop a broad base of more humble, sturdier animals. And through all of this, there's a human layer that rarely makes it into marble and inscription. Every aristocrat who wins renown on a fine charger depends on people whose names we almost never hear. The grooms who rise before dawn to curry coats and check hooves, who notice a slight heat in a leg, a new cough, a sour temper that hints at pain. Riders form bonds too. Greek and Roman sources occasionally hint at it. A general mourning a favourite mount, a cavalryman decorating a grave marker for his faithful companion. In quieter, unwritten moments, there are probably countless small rituals. A pat on the neck before a dangerous ride, a muttered word of thanks after a long march, a shared rhythm of breath in the minutes before a charge. In the classical world, horses sit at a strange intersection. They are tools of war and administration. They are symbols of rank carved into law and census tables. They are living beings that require care, graze in real fields, fall ill in real mud. And for the humans who live with them daily, they are also individuals with quirks and tempers woven into personal stories of pride, fear, and affection. As empires grow more complex, those intersections only multiply. Beyond Greece and Rome along the great caravan routes of Asia, horses will start to link not just cities within a state, but civilizations separated by deserts and mountains. Speed, once a local advantage, becomes a commodity that can be traded, taxed, and fought over. When we talk about the Silk Road, it's easy to picture only one thing moving. Silk, shimmering bolts of luxury cloth winding their way from China toward the Mediterranean, changing hands in dusty caravanserais, ending up on the shoulders of emperors. But for long stretches of its history, the Silk Road is also a horse road. In fact, for some states, horses are the whole point. On the eastern end of Eurasia, Chinese dynasties sit in rich river valleys, growing grain and mulberry trees, raising pigs and chickens, weaving silk in quantities that seem almost magical to outsiders. On the northern and western fringes across the steppe, live peoples whose wealth looks very different: grass, herds, and above all horses. The agrarian states have infantry and numbers and walls. What they do not have in most periods are enough high-quality war horses, trained for riding, bred for endurance and speed. The steppe polities have exactly that, so a strange balance of terror and dependence begins to form. Sedentary empires need steppe horses for their own cavalry, for their royal guards, for their messenger systems. The steppe riders in turn want what the cities can make: grain surpluses, metalwork, fine textiles, luxuries that can be redistributed to followers as gifts. Speed becomes a strategic commodity, not abstract speed, but literal, muscle and bone speed, measured in how far a mounted archer can ride in a day, how quickly a messenger can bring word of a revolt, how rapidly a border army can appear where a wall is thin. Along the routes we now bundle together as the Silk Road, caravans move more than silk. Chinese silk and lacquer travel outward. Central Asian horses, wool and felt travel inward. From the west come glassware, metal tools, wine, and later more and more silver and coin. Ideas ride in the same caravans. Religions drift along these paths. Buddhism, later Islam, strands of Christianity carried by merchants who stop to trade and to talk. Technologies move too. New bow designs, improved saddles, stirrup variations, better harnessing techniques, new ways of shoeing or not shoeing hooves depending on terrain. Behind the romantic label horse cultures lie societies that have organized almost every part of life around mobile herds. They are not all the same. Scythians, Xiongnu, Huns, early Turks, later Uyghurs and others, different languages, different political structures, different religious practices. What they share is a deep familiarity with life on horseback. Children ride young. Adults navigate by the feel of the land under their mounts' hooves. Herds are wealth, status, and savings account combined. Because of this, horses themselves become diplomatic instruments. Chinese sources describe periods when thousands of bolts of silk are sent north and west each year in exchange for heavenly horses, animals said to sweat blood, probably because of skin parasites but seen as signs of divine favour and speed. Some of these arrangements are framed as trade. Others are framed as tribute. A court may call it bribing the barbarians to keep the peace. Steppe rulers may describe it as proof that the settled empire acknowledges their equal or superior status. Either way, the effect is concrete. Border fortresses are built or reinforced not only to keep raiders out, but to control where trade is allowed in. Seasonal markets are established along frontiers where steppe envoys and merchants can bring horses and leave with grain, cloth and metal. War planning starts to revolve around the horse supply. If a dynasty has a bad year for pastures inside its borders, or an outbreak of disease among its remount herds, its ability to field effective cavalry drops. Suddenly, the next treaty negotiation with steppe neighbours is not just about prestige, but about how many mounts can be acquired, at what price, and on what schedule. Conversely, when a strong steppe confederation controls key pastures and breeding grounds, it can use horses as leverage, refuse to trade, and a neighbouring empire's cavalry arm slowly withers. Agree to trade, and elite guards, postal riders, and shock troops all get fresh, powerful animals. But caravans and herds don't just carry power, they also carry vulnerabilities. Every time traders, envoys and camp followers meet at a frontier market, they exchange microbes as well as goods. Animal diseases move with herds along these routes. So do human plagues helped along by fleas and lice on pack animals and riders. At the same time, the same networks spread cures and preventions, veterinary techniques, herbal treatments, better fodder practices, new methods for managing overgrazed pastures. Cultural exchange runs just as deep. Steppe motifs appear on luxury goods in imperial capitals, animal-style art, swirling predators and prey, borrowed into court jewellery and weapon fittings. Sedentary religious ideas filter into the steppe, sometimes reinterpreted through older sky and ancestor cults. A new saddle design, tested by one group of riders, gets copied by another. A better method of making composite bows spreads from one language group to the next. A clever trick for loading a pack animal more efficiently saves unnamed labourers a few seconds in 100 different camps. When you zoom out, the Silk Road looks less like a single ribbon and more like a mesh. Strands of trade in silk, in horses, in grain, in iron, in stories, in techniques. Strands of tribute and raiding, strands of marriage alliances where a princess travels with her own horses and grooms, bringing one riding tradition into another court. All woven together by the simple, stubborn fact that on land, for most of this era, nothing moves people, messages, or intentions faster than a good horse on an open road. And the more societies lean on that speed, the more they find themselves reshaped by the bargains, dependencies, and dangers that come with it. By the time silk and horses are flowing back and forth across Eurasia, something else is crystallizing around the horse. A new kind of person. The mounted warrior who isn't just a soldier, but a social class. An identity, a problem and a solution wrapped in armour and horsehair. To make sense of this, it helps to slow the picture down. Armoured cavalry is not just a guy on a horse with metal on, it's a system. To field even one effective heavy cavalryman, you need a large, strong horse that can carry the rider, the armour, the weaponry, and still move fast enough to matter. You need a saddle that distributes weight, tack that doesn't rub the animal raw, and a supply of good fodder that keeps that living machine from breaking down. You need remounts, spare horses that let a rider fight more than one battle or ride more than one campaign season without destroying his mount. You need farriers to shoe hooves, or at least trim them. You need grooms to clean wounds and tack sores. You need pastures, stables, fodder markets, and the taxes to pay for them. Every time you see a knight cantering through a medieval romance, or a line of armoured lancers in a tapestry, imagine the invisible shadows behind each one. 10, 20, sometimes 30 humans whose labour keeps that one fighter possible. In Europe, this system hardens into the knightly class. A boy born into a noble household might begin as a page around 7 or 8. He serves at table, runs errands, learns manners, songs, basic literacy if he is lucky, and, almost from the beginning, learns to be around horses without fear. He watches older boys and men ride, clean tack, feed, curry, and control temperamental animals. As a teenager, if he seems promising and his family can afford it, he becomes a squire to an established knight. Now the training intensifies. He rides daily. He learns to vault into the saddle in heavy padding, to control a mount with his knees, while his hands handle shield and lance. He practices tilting in the yard, taking and giving blows, falling without dying. He sharpens blades, polishes armour, hauls water, feeds and brushes the war horse that is not his, but that he is responsible for. Only after years of this pipeline, after battles observed from the edges and maybe a few small fights joined, is he made a knight. But his horse has had a parallel education. Foaled in a stud farm or noble estate that has been selecting for strength and temperament for generations, the animal is weaned, halter, broken, led, desensitized to noise and strange objects. It learns to tolerate weight, then riders, then the shock of formations and the chaos of other animals around it. If the horse proves too nervous or too fragile, it doesn't become a destrier or a courser. It becomes a pack animal, a riding palfrey, or ends up pulling a cart. The warhorse is the result of decades of human planning and years of daily work, just as much as the knight is. On the Eurasian steppe, the shapes are different, but the logic is similar. There, the training pipeline begins even earlier and is spread across whole communities. Children ride almost as soon as they can walk steadily. They grow up herding, moving with the animals, reading the land by watching how their horses move under them. Their cavalry traditions emphasize mobility and archery rather than heavy armor and lance shocks. Instead of a few elite, massively expensive warhorses, a steppe warrior depends on a string of tough, smaller mounts, each capable of living on rough pasture, each rotated to keep them fresh. The investment is not so much in iron plate and stone keeps, but in herds and in the knowledge of pastures and water. European knights tend to fight in relatively compact formations, armoured to absorb blows, riding horses bred and fed for explosive bursts of power. Steppe riders tend to avoid getting hit at all. They swarm, harass, feint retreats, loose arrows at distances that make a knight's lance feel very short. Their armour, where used, is often lighter, favouring speed and stamina over protection. It might be tempting to ask who was better, but that question misses the point. Each tradition is built for its environment and for the enemies its people expect to face. On wet, hedged, ploughed medieval European terrain, where infantry with shields and spears can anchor a line, a small number of armoured riders can be devastating in the right moment, breaking formations, exploiting gaps, chasing down fleeing foes. On open grasslands where there are few obstacles and where supply lines ride on hooves, the steppe style of constant motion, multiple remounts and long-range missile fire is almost perfectly adapted. Neither works well without support. Knights are most effective when combined with infantry, crossbowmen and archers, when castles and walled towns provide safe anchors and supply depots. Steppe cavalry are most effective when backed by herds, scouts, and a network of camps that can move with the seasons, when they can avoid siege warfare and instead control wide spaces. These differences don't just shape battles, they shape everyday life. Castles do not sprout randomly on hillsides in Europe. They appear where mounted raiders can pass, where fields and villages need protection, where a knightly family can ride out to patrol roads and collect dues. To a peasant in a valley, the horse is not only a plough animal or a distant symbol of romance. It is the sound of hooves on the road signalling a lord's men coming to enforce a tax. It is the thunder of a raid, neighbours' grain stores put to the torch because they belong to the wrong side in a feud. It is the clatter of mounted patrols that might deter bandits, or might themselves behave like them. On the steppe, horses and riders define the rhythm of the year. Camps move with the herds, decisions about alliances, feuds and leadership are tied to who can muster how many riders and remounts. Distant villages and trading towns learn to watch the horizon at certain seasons, hoping that the approaching riders want trade, not tribute collected at sword point. Because the horse can turn a human into a fast-moving, hard-hitting weapon, societies tend to give the people who control those weapons special status. In Europe, that becomes formalized in law. Knights and nobles often have legal privileges, different courts, different penalties, rights to carry arms and to demand service. Land is granted in exchange for mounted military duty. Social rank is tied to the right and obligation to fight on horseback. On the steppe, the details vary from people to people, but the pattern is similar. Lineages that can field more riders, that control more herds, and that can maintain loyalty with gifts of horses and plunder. tend to become the ruling clans. Their authority rests at least partly on the threat and promise encoded in cavalry: we can protect you, or we can ride you down. Prestige follows the horse. Poems, epics, and lore codes from both worlds praise the good rider, the man who knows horses. They describe fines and compensations in horses, not coins. They treat the warhorse almost as an extension of the warrior's body, and by extension as a marker of his worth. In a slow, subtle way, the animal that once ran wild across Ice Age plains has become something stranger. Not just a partner in work or travel, but a hinge for hierarchy. Who can afford to raise warhorses? Who has the time, space, and teachers to learn to fight on them? Who lives under the shadow of their hooves? As battles evolve and new weapons appear, the horse will not always keep its place at the very centre of war. But for many centuries, to control fast, deadly men on fast, powerful horses is to control what landscapes mean. Whether a valley is safe or exposed, whether a road is a trade route or a hunting ground for raiders. And that, in turn, means that the story of cavalry is not only about tactics and armour. It is a story about how entire societies bend themselves around the needs, the vulnerabilities, and the prestige of the horse. By the time the Middle Ages are in full swing, one group on the steppe pushes this whole logic of horses and riders to an almost frightening clarity. The Mongols do not invent steppe warfare, they inherit it. What they do is turn it into a system so efficient, so disciplined, that to many of their enemies it feels less like an army and more like a natural disaster. At the heart of that system is something deceptively simple. Not the famous composite bow, not even the reputation for brutality. It's the remount. A typical Mongol warrior does not ride into battle on his horse. He rides with a small moving ecosystem of horses. 4, 5, sometimes more, each one lightly loaded, each one rotated through the day. When one animal starts to sweat and tire, he simply switches saddles and keeps going. To a knight used to one big precious warhorse, this is almost incomprehensible. But on the steppe, it's the key to everything. Multiple remounts mean speed, not just in bursts, but over days and weeks. An army can ride 40, 60, even 100 kilometers in a day, and do it again tomorrow. Scouts can range far ahead and still be back in time to report. Columns can converge from different directions with uncanny precision. From the outside, this looks like magic. How do they appear out of nowhere? How do they vanish into the horizon and then reappear hundreds of miles away? The answer is hooves. Lots and lots of hooves, carefully managed. But horses alone don't create an empire. You also need minds to match the mobility. Mongol campaigns are famous for their archery, the whistling arrows launched from those compact recurved bows. But behind every rain of arrows is something less visible and more important: information. Scouts ride ahead, sometimes for weeks, mapping rivers, forage, enemy positions. Messengers shuttle between columns. Commanders gather this moving picture and adjust plans in near real time. For this to work, riders can't just be brave. They have to be literate in the language of distance and time. How long will it take to get from this river to that pass with tired horses? How many days of grazing does a valley provide for 10,000 animals? If a bridge is burned, where is the next ford? And can the herd make the detour without losing strength? The Mongol answer is usually yes, because someone has already ridden it, counted it, remembered it. Discipline ties it all together. Mongol armies are organized into units of tens, hundreds, thousands, each with clear responsibility. Punishments for disobedience can be severe, but the reward is that when an order to feign retreat, to wheel left, to encircle goes out, thousands of riders execute the maneuver as if they share one nervous system. That coordination turns mobility into power, Now imagine what this means at the scale of continents. A ruler in Karakoram can send an order and know that, in a surprisingly short time, it will ripple out along a web of horse paths, through relay stations where fresh mounts wait across deserts and mountain passes, to the towns and kingdoms on the receiving end. The Mongol presence often feels like a looming terror. Stories of massacres, pyramids of skulls, and cities put to the torch spread like smoke on the wind. Those stories are not pure invention. Violence is part of the repertoire, sometimes used with deliberate theatricality. But beneath the fear there is a quieter reality that makes empire possible and keeps it running after the shock of conquest fades. Administration. Once surrendered, many cities are not destroyed. They are taxed, craftsmen are registered, translators are valued. Roads and relay stations are maintained or expanded. Caravan routes are patrolled by the same riders who once terrified them. Horses that carried arrows now carry accountants. Because the Mongols understand something very practical. If you can keep people and goods moving safely, wealth flows toward you. Horse networks that once served raiders become arteries for trade. Caravans crossing Central Asia can travel with a degree of security that merchants in earlier centuries could only dream of. A thief or small bandit is nothing against a patrol that can be summoned by a fast rider and a fresh remount. Specialists move too. Engineers from northern China appear under Mongol banners in Persia, helping with siegecraft and irrigation. Artisans, scribes, doctors and astrologers are relocated across thousands of kilometers, often unwillingly, but once moved, they plug into new networks. The horse makes these transfers possible on a scale, and with a speed that reshapes entire regions. Yet this Mongol moment is not something the rest of the world can simply copy. It rests on environmental habits that are hard to improvise, populations already skilled at living off mobile herds, landscapes of open grass where vast numbers of horses can graze, cultural expectations that almost every adult male can ride and fight. It also rests on a particular political chemistry. Charismatic leaders who can hold rival clans together. A willingness to enforce discipline even on elites. A habit of integrating foreign administrators and knowledge keepers into the imperial machine. Where those ingredients are missing, trying to build a Mongol-style empire by decree won't work. You can buy horses, but you can't instantly create communities that think in days of riding distance or measure wealth in the number of remounts you can feed over winter. Still, for a few generations, the world lives under the shadow of this horse-borne system. Maps redraw themselves. Trade routes shift. News, orders and ideas begin to move with a speed that surprises even those who launch them. And out of this moving web of hooves and riders, something new emerges, an understanding that if you can connect far-flung places quickly and predictably, you don't just win battles. You change what it means for a world to be far away. Once you realize that speed on horseback can redraw an empire, the next step is almost inevitable. You stop thinking of horses only as weapons or as engines dragging carts. You start thinking of them as carriers of messages. The moment you do that, distance begins to collapse. Picture a chain of stations stretching across a landscape. Every 20, 30, maybe 40 kilometers, a small compound, a few grooms, a cluster of horses, fodder stacked under cover, maybe a clerk with a wax tablet or a bundle of paper. A rider arrives blowing dust, slides from the saddle, shoves a document into the clerk's hands. He doesn't keep going. The message does. A fresh rider swings up onto a fresh horse and is gone within minutes, the letter tucked into a leather tube or knotted in a corner of his coat. One human body can only endure so many hours in the saddle. One horse can only gallop so far before its muscles fill with lactic acid and its hooves begin to crack. But a relay network is different. It strings together hundreds of short sprints into one long, continuous movement. Time that used to be measured in weeks becomes days. Days become hours. States notice, long before the Mongols, the Achaemenid kings of Persia set up something like this. Herodotus, never shy about drama, describes royal couriers who are neither snow nor rain, nor heat nor night, stopped from completing their routes. Behind the flourish is a very practical system. Way stations stocked with horses and fodder along the royal road, a spine stretching from the Aegean to the plains near modern Iran. In a different corner of the world, Chinese dynasties do their own version. Under the Han, and later the Tang, a state-run post-road network ties the capital to distant provinces. Horses, mules and ponies wait at official post houses. Couriers travel with tall passes that authorize them to claim fresh mounts and food. The Mongol yam, the relay system you just heard about, plugs into older Central Asian habits but scales them up. Postal stations dot the steppe, spaced so a fast rider can reach the next one in a few hours. Some are simple felt camps. Others evolve into small settlements with warehouses, pastures and bureaucrats. These systems are not identical. They grow out of different ecologies, different political cultures. A Persian road running along river valleys, a Chinese highway cut across mountain passes, a Mongol track fading into open grass. What they share is the logic of compression. To make them work, someone has to think about fodder in the same way later ages will think about coal or gasoline. How much hay and grain does it take to keep 50 horses ready at this station through winter? Where will that fodder come from? Who pays the peasants who grow it, and what happens to them in a bad year? There are human needs to cover too. Couriers need places to eat, sleep, repair gear. Out of that necessity emerge inns, post houses, caravanserais. Some are state-run, others semi-private but regulated, expected to host official riders when required. Alongside the horses and roofs grows something quieter, paperwork. Somebody keeps lists of which horses are at which station, which ones are lame, which ones have been borrowed by a local noble and never returned. Permits authorize who can use the relay and who cannot. Seals authenticate messages so a provincial governor knows this order really did come from the capital. On parchment, on bamboo slips, on thin sheets of beaten mulberry bark, an invisible web of authorization begins to spread. When information starts to move faster, law moves with it. A decree issued at the centre no longer drifts outwards like a rumour. It arrives on a named day, with an expectation that it will be obeyed by another named day. Tax assessments can be updated when a flood ruins a harvest, not years later when word finally reaches someone who cares. Armies change their rhythm too. Before reliable couriers, many campaigns are essentially blind gambles. A general sets out not entirely sure where allies or enemies are, hoping that scouts will stumble upon them before it is too late. With a working horse post, coordination becomes less guesswork, more choreography. Detachments can be recalled, reinforcements can be redirected. Threats can be reported today and answered next week, not next year. Sometimes that speed is the difference between a rebellion being crushed early or growing into a civil war. Merchants quietly ride this wave. A trader who knows that a new tax has been levied in one city but not yet in another can shift routes, get goods through before tariffs rise, or divert cargo away from ports about to be blockaded. In this sense, horse relays are not just state tools. They are early bandwidth. Not everyone experiences this the same way. For a villager whose entire world used to be the hills around their fields, the arrival of a dusty messenger bearing an order from an unseen king can be unsettling. Power that was once distant, almost mythical, becomes abruptly physically present. For a minor official in a frontier town, the same system brings both comfort and anxiety. Comfort, because problems can be reported and help might actually arrive. Anxiety, because mistakes and delays are now more visible to those above. For rulers and elites, something more abstract begins to shift. When you can send a thought across mountains and have it answered within a season, far away changes meaning. Regions that once felt like separate worlds become administrative districts. A map stops being a patchwork of loosely connected zones and starts to look, in the mind's eye, like one integrated body with nerves running along the roads. Horses become those nerves. Each gallop stroke is a tiny physical act of connection, turning scattered valleys and cities into something closer to a single organism. Over time, this doesn't just make states stronger. It changes how people imagine space and time themselves. If the capital is no longer months away, but only a handful of relay stages, loyalty and fear adjust. So does ambition. A provincial governor might begin to dream of influence across the realm, precisely because messages can now carry his schemes that far. All of this rests on the horse's simple ability to convert grass into motion. But once harnessed to messages, instead of just men and cargo, that motion starts to do something more elusive. It rewires mental maps. The world feels smaller, faster, more tightly spun. Paths that were once rare adventures become predictable routes. News becomes something you expect, not a surprise when it arrives. In the long story of humans and horses, this is one of the strangest transformations. An animal that evolved to flee predators across open steppe becomes, in our hands, a courier of invisible things, commands, rumours, contracts, promises. And each time a message moves at a gallop, the gap between here and there narrows a little more, preparing us, slowly, almost without noticing, for a future in which even horses will feel too slow. If horses could shrink empires by carrying thoughts, they could also quietly fatten them by moving dirt. To see that, you have to leave the post road and walk out into fields. For most of human history, the heavy work of farming in Eurasia is done by oxen. Slow, patient, built like low-slung tanks, yoke them to a simple ard plough, and they'll drag a furrow through light soils if you aren't in a hurry. But as populations grow and forests fall, people start pushing into heavier, wetter, more stubborn ground. Clay that clings, sod that resists. On that kind of earth, an ox can still pull, but not fast, not deep, not for as many hours. A horse, properly harnessed, is different. The trick is properly harnessed. Early on, people literally choke horses with ox-style yokes that press against the windpipe. That's fine if you're dragging a light cart at walking pace. It's a death sentence if you ask for hard traction. At some point in late antiquity or the early Middle Ages in parts of Eurasia, a new idea spreads: the horse collar. A padded loop that rests on the shoulders and chest, leaving the airway free. Combine that with iron shoes to protect hooves on hard ground, and suddenly a horse can lean its full weight into a load. Now hitch that horse to a heavy-wheeled plough, the kind with an iron share and a mouldboard that cuts, lifts, and flips a ribbon of soil. On many northern European soils this combination proves crucial. One horse can plough more land faster than an ox team, or a team of horses can do in a few good days what used to take weeks. This isn't just about convenience. More land turned at the right time means more grain. More grain means more people can be fed away from the farm. And those people do other things: bake, weave, build, pray, write, fight. Put enough of these small advantages together, and you start to get market towns. The same animal that might haul a knight in war is also hauling sacks of wheat to weekly fairs. Carts creak along rutted tracks, iron-bound wheels biting into mud, horses leaning forward, breathing clouds in the morning chill. At first these are simple exchanges: surplus grain traded for salt, tools, cloth. But as roads stabilize and bridges appear, something changes. The radius of reliable movement widens. A farmer a day's ride from town can now plan to send in a wagon load of rye, knowing it will get there and back. Millers can invest in better grinding stones because grain arrives regularly. Bakers can start thinking in terms of customers they have never met. Watermills and windmills multiply, often with horses feeding them indirectly. Mills need stone, timber, iron fittings. Horses drag those from quarry and forest. Millers move flour into town behind a patient gelding who knows the way by habit. In cities, dependence becomes even more intimate. Every barrel of water in an upper-story kitchen began as something that had to be moved. In some places, aqueducts handle part of the job, but inside walls and on streets, horses and mules are the normal solution. They pull wagons loaded with firewood, bricks, grain, fish, manure, human waste. They drag sledges of stone for cathedrals, turn capstans at building sites, haul beer from breweries, wine from docks, garbage to the edges of town. Many people in pre-industrial cities never own a horse, never ride one, never touch one. And yet their lives are wrapped in horse labour like thread on a spool. You can hear it in the background of any busy day before engines, the ring of a hoof on cobblestone, the jingle of harness, the muffled thud of a dray starting its load. As the workload diversifies, so do the horses. Not every animal is built to gallop with a courier or charge in battle. Selective breeding starts to pull horse populations in different directions. Some lineages are pushed toward sheer strength and calm, thick necks, broad chests, heavy bones, steady temperaments. These become the great draft horses, the ancestors of Shires, Percherons, Clydesdales. They are designed to start a heavy wagon from a dead stop, to pull a plough through gluey soil, to stand in harness for hours without panic. Others are refined in the opposite direction, lighter frames, longer legs, quick reactions, riding horses for messengers, merchants, soldiers. Intermediate types pull coaches and carriages, needing both endurance and style. Underneath these bodies lies an entire support system most chronicles barely mention. Horses do not park themselves, refuel themselves, and roll off the lot ready to go every morning. They need fodder, hayfields cut and dried in good weather, oat crops dedicated not to humans, but to animals that move humans. In some medieval and early modern regions, a significant slice of arable land is effectively turned into living fuel for horse muscles. They need shelter, stables that stay above freezing, dry enough to keep hooves from rotting, ventilated enough to keep ammonia from burning lungs. In towns, these are tucked behind inns, inside courtyards, under guild houses. They need maintenance, farriers trim hooves and fit shoes, a skilled craft that knows how iron, horn and bone interact. Harness makers and saddlers stitch leather and shape wood. Teamsters learn how to balance a load and read the tiny flickers of fatigue and irritation in an animal's ears and tail. They need medicine. Long before formal veterinary science, grooms and healers accumulate recipes and routines, poultices for swollen joints, mash for sick stomachs, careful cooling after heavy work. Some of it is superstition. Some of it surprisingly effective empirical knowledge passed along in stable yards rather than universities. All of this takes people time, land and money. A city's horsepower sits on ledgers long before it sits in streets. Costs for fodder, stable rents, wages for drivers, payments to farriers and vets, fees for road and bridge use. Every sack of flour in a baker's storeroom carries a hidden surcharge for the horses that brought the grain, plus the horses that hauled the millstones, plus the horses that moved the firewood that baked the bread. Every cathedral stone, every load of charcoal smouldering in a metalworker's furnace, Every bundle of wool in a weaver's attic has a similar, invisible shadow. And then there are the places where horse labour goes even deeper out of sight. Mines, for instance. Descend into the shaft of a coal or metal mine in early modern Europe, and you might find ponies or small horses living much of their lives underground, hauling ore in low tunnels where humans cannot easily pull sledges, walking in circles to power, winding gear that raises buckets to the surface. Above ground, other teams drag ore to smelters, tug timber props from nearby woods, move barrels of finished metal to river or port. Here, the horse is literally the muscle behind the furnace that will one day smelt the iron rails and beams of the industrial age that will replace it. By the 18th and 19th centuries in some regions, urban and industrial horse populations reach astonishing numbers. In London, Paris, New York, streets are crowded not just with people but with the animals that make dense human life possible. It is easy, from the distance of a motorized world, to see horses as symbols of speed, nobility, or war. But for most people who actually lived in the centuries before engines, the horse was something more prosaic and more profound. It was the hidden piston in the daily machine, eating in darkness so someone else could walk on lit streets, straining into harness so markets could function, stumbling through mud so stone and grain and water could be where they needed to be. Behind every horse-powered age stands an army of actual horses, and behind them a quieter host of humans whose job it was to keep that living engine running. An empire might be imagined on paper, might be held together by messages at a gallop. But its weight, its roads, its walls, its food, its fires, was carried, shoveled, dragged, and turned by hooves. Empires rarely stay satisfied with one coastline. Once you have roads and carts and cavalry and a whole administrative nervous system built around horses, it feels natural to imagine that system stretching over the next hill, across the sea. But horses cannot swim oceans, not in fleets. They have to be carried. So, in the age of sail, the same animal that once turned village mills becomes cargo, packed into the dark between decks, slung in slings so they don't fall when the ship rolls, fed and watered by exhausted grooms who fight rot, colic, storms, and time. Many don't make it. The ones that do arrive as a kind of mobile technology transfer. They step off those ships into worlds that have not seen a horse for thousands of years. In the Americas, the last native horses died out at the end of the Ice Age. For tens of millennia, people lived, hunted, farmed, and fought without them. They built rich, complex societies based on feet, canoes, dogs, and human muscle. Then, in the 16th century, Europeans bring horses back to the continent where the family first evolved. At first there aren't many, a few dozen here, a few hundred there, tied tightly to colonial forts and plantations, guarded as jealously as muskets. They change things anyway. A mounted messenger can link coastal outposts faster than any runner. Cavalry gives small invading forces a shock advantage. Speed, height, the ability to close distance before someone reloads a bow or a clumsy firearm. Draft horses and mules pull cannon, wagons and supplies inland, projecting an empire's reach away from the sea. But horses are not just tools of conquest, they are also living refugees, escape artists. Some slip their tethers or are turned loose. They survive. They breed on some grasslands and open ranges. They spread rapidly, becoming feral populations that Europeans will later call mustangs and others will simply call the horses. Indigenous peoples encounter them not as exotic court animals but as neighbours, competitors for grazing, potential allies in the work of staying alive. Adoption is not uniform or instant. In settled farming regions with dense forests, like much of eastern North America, horses come first as trade goods and status markers. They pull ploughs, carry loads, and serve as diplomatic gifts, woven into existing hierarchies. On the plains and plateaus, the story bends a different way. Here, once horses become available in sufficient numbers through trade, raiding, capture, some groups begin to rewire their economies and identities around them. Over time, peoples who had farmed, hunted on foot, or combined both become specialists in mounted life. Bison hunts change profoundly. A rider can follow and turn a herd, select individual animals, bring meat and hides back from farther away. This can mean more food, more robes to trade, more mobility in choosing wintering grounds. Warfare changes too. Raids can strike from farther off and vanish faster. Feuds that once played out in days of stalking on foot compress into minutes of thundering approach and retreat. Horses become both weapons and prizes, their theft and defense feeding cycles of conflict and alliance. Trade networks stretch. A family with enough horses can move more goods, travel to distant fairs or rendezvous, act as middlemen between regions. Some societies develop intricate horse wealth systems where owning and gifting animals becomes a measure of generosity, influence, and adulthood. But none of this is a simple rise from foot people to horse people. Some communities resist deep dependence on horses, wary of the costs. Others embrace them, then rethink when grazing pressure, droughts, or colonial borders make large herds hard to sustain. Even within a single nation, different bands or clans may choose different paths. The ecological and human consequences are tangled. Grazing herds, European livestock and feral horses together, compete with native grazers and trample fragile soils. Old trails widen into dusty corridors. New weeds arrive in fodder and manure. Along with horses come microbes. Not because the animals carry all the diseases themselves, but because they allow colonists, soldiers, traders and settlers to move faster and deeper into continents whose populations have little immunity to old world pathogens. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other diseases travel at the speed of caravans and campaigns. Displacement accelerates. Mounted colonial forces push into interior lands. Mounted indigenous groups, newly mobile, can resist longer and strike harder, but they can also be drawn into resource competitions that didn't exist before, over horses, over pasture, over access to trade, in animal products that empires now value. In some places, horses become symbols of cultural resilience, carried in songs, ceremonies, and names. In others, they are remembered as part of the machinery that broke older ways of life. Most of the time they are both at once. A young rider learning to sit bareback, feeling the world slip by faster than a run, is touching the same strange power that let empires stretch their fingers across oceans. A power that doesn't belong to any one people or project, but that can be harnessed in very different directions. By the time the great exchange of plants, animals and diseases has done its work, the horse is no longer just a Eurasian or African animal. It is woven into the daily realities, hopes and losses of communities from Patagonia to the Arctic, from Caribbean sugar fields to Andean highlands. It has crossed the water, and in doing so it has helped redraw the human map. If you live in a world shaped by horses long enough, they stop being just useful animals. They become part of how you imagine yourself, across continents in stories told around fires and in stone, on temple walls and in whispered blessings. Horses start to appear in a very particular role, not as pets, not quite as gods, but as the creatures that stand right on the threshold between worlds. In some traditions, that threshold is literal. A horse pulls the sun's chariot across the sky, or carries a storm god into battle. In others, a white mare emerges from the sea, or a black stallion rises from underground springs. People don't agree on the details, but the pattern is clear, where there is motion between realms, sky and earth, land and water, life and death. Horses very often do the carrying. That isn't random. If the fastest thing you can see with your own eyes is a galloping horse, then the feeling of crossing distance at impossible speed becomes tied in your nervous system to that animal. When a ruler needs to be seen as more than just another person with a bigger house, they reach for the same association. Kings, queens, chiefs, and emperors sit on horses in public, ride in chariots, surround themselves with carefully bred and decorated mounts. The message is simple. I move differently from you. I cross distances you can't. Sovereignty gets fused with horsepower. Freedom too. On steppe plains in deserts. On the open range. A horse is the practical difference between being bound to a small circle of land and being able to slip over the horizon. So the animal that lets you outrun enemies, taxes and droughts becomes an emblem of independence. A runaway slave stealing a horse, a young nomad riding beyond the far hills, a messenger darting through checkpoints. Again and again the act of getting onto a horse becomes a quiet ritual of defiance. Around this, people build actual rituals. Some of the most striking are about death. In many cultures, high-status men and women are buried with their horses, or at least with horse skulls, legs, harness, and chariot parts. Archaeologists argue over the exact meanings, but whatever the theology, the emotional logic is easy to feel. You rode with this companion in life. You shouldn't have to walk in the next world. Elsewhere, horses are sacrificed rather than buried alive. Carefully killed, carefully laid out. Skins stretched, bones arranged, heads oriented towards some sacred direction. Offerings to gods of war, of fertility, of the sun. Not casual killing, but a costly gift, because a horse's value is not abstract. It ploughs fields, carries you to battle, pulls your carts. Giving one up hurts. There are gentler rites, seasonal races that double as prayer. If the horses run well, the crops will grow. Parades where rulers and priests ride through streets dense with people, blessings flowing outward from horseback down to the crowd. Oaths sworn while touching a mane or a bridle. Children lifted for their first wobbling ride as part of coming-of-age ceremonies. Laughter wrapped around something more serious. You are joining a community of riders now. And beneath all of this, there is the daily, private relationship that rarely makes it into chronicles. Someone has to clean hooves, rub down sweat, pick burrs from a tail. Someone learns exactly how this mare shies at flapping cloth, how that gelding hates sudden hands near his ears. People give horses names, nicknames, little songs. They talk to them while alone in the early morning, in stables that smell of hay and leather, in fields where the only witnesses are birds. Trust is built in tiny repetitions. A rider who asks too much and listens too little gets thrown, trampled, or quietly disobeyed. A rider who learns to feel the shift of muscle under them, to ease off when the breath turns harsh, to praise when fear is mastered, ends up with an animal that will follow them into fire and noise and chaos. When those animals die, the grief is specific. Not the mourning for a god, not exactly the loss of a tool, but something like a mixture of friend, colleague, and extension of self. People cut manes and tails for keepsakes. They keep old saddles and bridles long after a horse is gone. They carve names into stable walls. They write poems, if their culture writes, about the sound of hooves that will not echo again. Literature and folklore trap these feelings like amber. Epic heroes often have horses with personalities sharper than some of the human sidekicks. Folk tales send wise mares to warn their riders, clever stallions to outthink demons, tireless ponies to carry lovers or fugitives through the night. Even in later ages when horse ownership is rare, children's stories and romantic novels keep circling back to the same images. The trusted mount, the dangerous ride, the bond no one else quite understands. Underneath all the symbolism, the material reality keeps its grip. Horses are symbols of nobility because, for thousands of years, only those with surplus land, labour and fodder could afford them. They stand for freedom because they actually did let people slip past borders and deadlines. They march in coronations and funerals because they once carried the very messages and weapons that made thrones possible. The myths are not separate from the work, they grow directly out of it. Every sun chariot, every sky horse, every story of a faithful steed waiting at the edge of the afterlife is, in some quiet way, a memory of sweating flanks, creaking harness, and the shared heartbeat of two species learning uneasily to move as one. But for all that intimacy, there are hard limits. A horse is not a mythic being. It is an animal with a gut, lungs, hooves, and a nervous system, and those pieces only work within a certain window. Step too far outside that window, and the partnership with humans begins to fray. Start with water. A healthy horse can sometimes go longer than you'd expect between drinks, especially if it's eating moist grass. But in hot, dry air, pulling or carrying weight, the clock runs fast. On a steppe with scattered rivers, you can plan around that. You follow known routes. You move at dusk and dawn. You graze and drink in rhythm with the land. Push into real desert, and everything becomes a calculation. You can't load a horse the way you can a camel, too much weight, and it overheats, stumbles, or founders. Too little water, and its big muscular body, the very thing that makes it powerful, turns into a liability. So desert societies that use horses often pair them with camels, donkeys, or oxen. The horses become specialists for raiding, for quick travel between wells, for short, intense bursts of movement. Not freight animals across empty sand. Then there's food. A horse's stomach is small for its size. It wants to eat a little, often, grass, hay, grains. On lush plains that's ideal. The animal drops its head and harvests its own fuel as you go. This is why steppe nomads could ride for days. Their herds were moving on a kind of living pasture. The land itself was the feed store. Move into forests or high mountains, and suddenly grass isn't where you need it, when you need it. You have to cut fodder, carry it, store it. Grain has to be grown somewhere else and brought in. Every mile you travel with pack horses is a mile in which some of their load is just their own food, over long distances that eats away at the advantage of speed. Temperature and altitude add another set of constraints. Horses grow thick winter coats. Some breeds tolerate snow and ice remarkably well, as long as they're moving and well fed. But ice under hooves is dangerous, and deep snow that supports reindeer or yaks may bog horses down to their chests. In high heat and humidity, they can't lose body heat fast enough. Above certain altitudes, their big oxygen-hungry muscles start to struggle. Human cultures notice these edges and adapt in different ways. On the open Eurasian grasslands you see small, tough horses, bred for endurance instead of size. Riders use simple saddles or pads that distribute weight over a broad area of the back, and stirrups that let them stand to relieve pressure and help the horse breathe on long runs. Rinds are short, riding styles loose and fluid, built around letting the animal pick its own sure path over uneven ground. In desert fringes you find lighter, fine-skinned horses, selected generation after generation for heat tolerance and the ability to go hard on sparse rations. Tack gets stripped down to essentials, light saddles, soft nosebands, minimal metal that won't burn in the sun. Riding becomes about conserving energy, short, decisive sprints, instead of steady trotting under a heavy load. In mountain regions, people breed for sure-footedness and calm. Smaller, stockier ponies do better than elegant chargers. Saddles may shift weight forward or backward to keep a low centre of gravity on steep slopes. Riders learn to dismount and lead on the worst climbs because the animal is more valuable as a living engine than as a seat. Over centuries, selective breeding sharpens these differences. Humans notice which mares can travel 3 days on poor forage without breaking down, which stallions stay steady near sheer drops, which foals stay healthy where the nights are brutal and the days burn your lungs. They pair those animals, cull others, trade bloodlines. Bit by bit, landscapes write themselves into horse bodies, the desert into the nerve and bone of Arabian lines, the cold wet north into the broad chests and dense coats of draft breeds, the thin-air highlands into ponies that trot where city horses would gasp. But even the best adapted horse stays vulnerable. A cavalry army looks invincible when it thunders across a plain. Logistically, it is fragile. Each rider needs not just his own food and water, but fodder for several 100 kilograms of animal. Hooves have to be picked and shod. Sweaty backs have to be dried to keep sores from turning into infections. Parasites, ticks, flies, intestinal worms thin the herd silently. A single contagious disease can do what no enemy spear can manage. History is full of campaigns that failed not because of human defeat, but because horses died faster than they could be replaced. Rain that turns roads into mud, snow that crusts and cuts, heat that rots hooves in standing water. All of it strikes at the legs and lungs of these animals. Sometimes predators do too. Wolves, big cats, human raiders slipping in at night to drive off or hamstring key mounts. In warm, wet regions, the invisible enemies are the worst. Try to push horses deep into parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and you meet tsetse flies and trypanosomes, parasites that carry sleeping sickness, devastating to equines. Elsewhere, mosquitoes and midges spread fevers that sweep through stables like fire. People notice patterns even if they don't know the microbes. They learn that horses sicken near certain rivers, in particular valleys, at particular times of year. They avoid, adapt, switch to other animals, or accept losses as the price of speed. When you zoom out, adaptation looks less like a simple story of humans shaping horses, and more like a conversation among 3 partners: people, animals, and landscape. The land offers possibilities and sets limits. Grass here, sand there, thin air on those far ridges. Horses respond with bodies that can stretch only so far. Humans work within that space, inventing saddles and bridles, breeding lines, grazing routes, caravan schedules, and military strategies that fit the narrow window in which a horse can thrive. Where that dialogue is harmonious, horses seem to erase distance, to turn vast plains and high passes into familiar paths. Where it breaks down, where ambition outpaces water, grass and air, the partnership falters. Hoofbeats slow, bones show under skin, and people are reminded that the creature carrying their dreams of freedom and power is still bound, absolutely, to the earth under its feet. For a moment, stay zoomed out. We've followed horses across plains and passes, through empires and deserts, watching how carefully their limits have to be respected. How every grand vision drawn by a human hand eventually runs up against lungs, hooves, parasites and grass. Now imagine you're living at a time when that entire balance starts to tilt. The world is getting louder. Cities are growing, not just as clusters of houses, but as machines that need to move food, fuel, stone, timber, and people every single day. Markets swell, armies get bigger, and governments begin to expect that news, orders, and taxes can cross hundreds of miles on a schedule. Not just when the roads are good, for centuries. Horses have been the go-to answer for all of that. More horses, bigger horses, finer horses. But by the early modern period, the strain is beginning to show. Before we follow that strain all the way into steam and steel, this is a good place to mention something quietly. If you've been enjoying drifting through these long arcs of history, we've gathered many of them into a book, gentle deep dives like this one, written to be read or listened to in the same calm way. It's available at sleepytimehistory.com, and for this week there's a discount there if you want a slower, page-turning version of these stories. No rush, no pressure, just another path through the same landscape. Back to our horses, standing at the edge of a new kind of battlefield. Gunpowder has been around for a while, but now firearms are getting more reliable. Muskets can be drilled with, standardized, issued in vast numbers. Infantry stop being loose clusters of men with spears and become drilled blocks of bodies that move as one, pour out volleys of lead, and reload by count and rhythm. On that kind of field, a rider charging straight at the front is suddenly a much riskier investment. Cavalry doesn't vanish, it changes. Heavy armoured horsemen who once tried to smash through lines by sheer mass start to feel clumsy and expensive. In their place, you see lighter cavalry, used more like a scalpel than a hammer. They scout, screen, chase fleeing enemies. They harass flanks, cut off messengers, pounce on baggage. They are still fast, still terrifying in the right moment, but less often the decisive core of battle. Where horses regain some of that central, shocking role is in a new hybrid, horse artillery. Artillery had long been the slow giant of the field. Huge guns dragged into position, fired, then left behind when the lines moved. But once someone has the idea to put lighter guns on special carriages and hitch them to teams trained to move and unlimber at speed, the tempo changes. Now a commander can hurl not just men, but explosive force across a battlefield. Batteries gallop forward, wheel into place, fire a few rounds, then limber up and race away before the enemy can respond. The horse isn't just carrying a single-armed man, it is hauling a device that projects death hundreds of meters away. Speed has migrated from the hooves to the shells, but without hooves, the shells don't arrive where they're needed. This is happening at the same time as cities are becoming true horse ecosystems of their own. Picture a 19th century metropolis, not by its buildings but by its smell and sound. Every cart of coal, every wagon of grain, every omnibus full of passengers is powered by animals that eat, drink, sweat, and leave manure behind. The more the city grows, the more horses it needs. Each of those animals consumes fodder grown on land that could otherwise feed humans. Each produces waste that has to go somewhere. Transport demand stretches out beyond city walls too. Railways are on the horizon, but before they arrive, postal systems, stagecoaches, and freight wagons all squeeze as much work as they can from horseflesh. Schedules tighten, margins of error shrink. Animals are pushed closer to their physiological edges, day after day, in numbers no medieval kingdom ever imagined. There's a sense, in hindsight, of a system straining at its seams. Humans are asking for more speed, more weight, more regularity than grass and muscle can comfortably supply. The very success of horsepower has created a kind of trap. You can solve many problems by adding more animals, but every new team of horses needs its own fields, its own farriers, its own stables and roads. Somewhere in that pressure, on battlefields thick with smoke, on streets choked with carts, in mines and mills where belts and gears are starting to hum, a different answer begins to look attractive. An engine that doesn't get tired, a machine that doesn't need pasture. Steam first, then internal combustion, will offer a way to uncouple motion from grass and oats. Not all at once, not cleanly, and not without its own new limits and disasters, but enough to start shrinking the horse from the centre of the human world to the edges. In the next part of our story, we'll watch that transition unfold. From rails beating out new iron roads across continents, to engines slipping under carriage bodies, to the moment when hooves, for the first time in thousands of years, are no longer the default sound of human travel. The first real crack in the old order isn't on the battlefield. It's on a pair of iron rails. Imagine you're used to the rhythm of horse travel. A good courier can maybe manage 8 or 10 miles an hour for a sustained journey, with fresh mounts at relay stations. A freight wagon is slower, its speed chained to the weakest animal in the team, the worst patch of road, the deepest mud. Then a steam locomotive rolls past. Even the earliest temperamental engines are doing 20 miles an hour with a full train behind them. Soon it's 30, then 40, with no need to rest, no need to graze, no nervous systems to overstimulate. Coal goes in, motion comes out. The cost per mile drops as the trains get bigger. One engine, properly maintained, can haul more cargo in a day than dozens of horses working to exhaustion. From the point of view of a government or a railway investor, there's no contest. Horses have to be bred, fed, trained and replaced when they go lame or die. Railways are expensive to build, but once the tracks are down, the marginal cost of each extra ton is astonishingly low. You can schedule trains to the minute. You can move army corps, grain harvests, timber and coal along the same corridor, day and night, in almost any weather. The horse's biggest advantage, mobility over rough ground, suddenly matters a little less when you can lay your own artificial ground, arrow straight across hundreds of miles. Still, change doesn't happen all at once. For a long time, the world is a tangle of old and new power. A regiment might take a train to the edge of a theatre of war, then disembark to march with horse-drawn guns. City dwellers might ride a horse omnibus from their street to the station, then transfer to a steam train that barrels them to another town, where another cab and pair of hooves takes them the last mile. Even inside cities, the transition is layered. Before motors, there are experiments with horse-drawn trams on rails, then cable cars pulled by buried moving cables, then electric streetcars. Horses still fill in the gaps. They haul coal to power stations, beer to pubs, milk to doorsteps. They pull the fire engines when alarms ring. They stand in harness outside theatres at night, steaming gently while their passengers enjoy the show. You can think of the 19th century as an era when horses and machines learned to share the same nervous system. Railways and telegraphs extend the reach of command. Horses still do most of the fine motor work at the ends of those lines. On paper, by the early 20th century, it might look as though the horse is finally being retired. Combustion engines are appearing under carriage bodies. Armies are experimenting with armoured cars and early tanks. Agricultural shows feature tractors as marvels of the age. Then the world goes to war on an industrial scale, and the numbers snap back. In 1914, the major European powers go to the First World War with more horses than any earlier conflict. Millions of animals are mobilized, cavalry mounts, artillery teams, supply wagons, ambulance units. Railways can bring shells and men close to the front, but from there it is still hooves and harness that move almost everything. Trench warfare shatters the dream of glorious cavalry charges. Horses become targets in landscapes of mud, barbed wire and machine gun fire. They sink into shell holes, inhale gas, break legs on shattered ground. Veterinary services grow huge almost overnight, trying to patch animals back together, inoculate them against disease, keep them fed on fronts where human soldiers are already going hungry. The logistics are staggering. Every horse needs forage, water, shoeing. In some sectors, more wagons are moving hay and oats to the front than ammunition. There are accounts from the time of entire offensives slowed or cancelled, because the animals are simply too exhausted to drag the guns through the muck. Second World War propaganda posters show tanks and aircraft, but again, reality is messier. The German Wehrmacht, often remembered as a fully mechanized force, relies heavily on horse-drawn transport, especially on the Eastern Front. Soviet and Polish peasants are conscripted along with their animals. Artillery batteries from multiple nations still depend on teams of horses to move guns and supplies over roads and fields where engines bog down or break. War, now amplified by steel and explosives, becomes one of the greatest consumers of horseflesh in history. At the same time, those wars accelerate the very technologies that will make such massive use of horses seem obsolete. Better engines, better roads, standardized fuel, mass production. When peace comes, even briefly, those same systems are turned towards civilian life. The balance finally tips. In cities, motor buses replace horse omnibuses. Trucks undercut freight wagons. Municipalities, once terrified of the manure crisis, the prediction that they would drown in the waste of their transport animals, discover that internal combustion produces its own invisible waste instead, slipping up chimneys and out exhaust pipes. On farms, tractors and mechanical harvesters start out as rare, expensive curiosities, then spread rapidly where fuel and credit are available. A single machine can plough or reap as much as many teams of horses in less time without needing pasture or winter hay. Draft horses decline sharply in number. Breeds once selected for steady strength are sidelined in favour of machines that can be traded, upgraded, or scrapped. The horse does not vanish. It slides sideways into new roles. What had been everyday necessity becomes sport. Fox hunting, steeplechases, polo, and racing take on a new tone as leisure activities for those who can afford to stable animals they no longer strictly need. Riding schools teach not farmers' children but urban children and adults who want contact with something living, powerful, and rooted in an older rhythm. Police forces keep mounted units because a person on horseback can still see over a crowd, still move through a dense street with a presence no bicycle or patrol car quite matches. Ceremonial units preserve cavalry uniforms, sabres, and gleaming tack for parades and state occasions. In many countries, rural communities keep horses in harness work, where terrain or economics still make engines impractical, or simply because the skills and the animals are there and cherished. The practical rewiring that horses once forced on human society's roads, staging posts, courier systems, cavalry doctrines, has been overlaid by a new circuitry of rails, highways, air routes, and fibre optic lines. But the memory of that earlier wiring persists. Our cities still follow routes first traced by hooves. Old coaching inns become hotels. Narrow streets that once carried single-file pack animals now funnel cars. Legal systems remember carriage rules in their traffic laws. Languages keep phrases like horsepower, hold your horses, on your high horse, long after most people have never held a rein. If you could look at the modern world from far above, you would see layers. The ghostly network of horse trails and caravan routes, the iron grid of rails, the concrete web of highways, the unseen mesh of data flowing through cables and satellites. Each one a way of moving information, bodies and goods. Each one built on the logic that speed and reliability change what is possible for humans. Horses wired us for that logic early. They taught us that with the right animal under you, the horizon could be closer than it looked. That distance could be negotiated instead of simply endured. Engines and circuits have taken over most of the work now. But the habits, the metaphors, the sense that the world can be rearranged by new ways of moving through it, that is a legacy with hoofprints baked deep into it. In the final part of our story, we'll turn from what horses did for our roads and armies to what they did inside our minds. How living beside a large, responsive, sometimes fragile animal for thousands of years has changed the way humans imagine power, partnership, and freedom itself. If you trace our story with horses from the first cautious herders on the steppe to the last great cavalry charges and the quiet riding schools of today, a pattern emerges. Horses didn't just carry us farther, They changed the meaning of father. For most of human history before them, distance was a kind of law. Villages, valleys, and river basins were worlds unto themselves. Trade existed, but it was slow, rare, and fragile. News spread at the pace of a walking body. Horses bent that rule. With an animal that could turn days into hours, frontiers became membranes instead of walls. States could reach into their hinterlands, send tax collectors and judges, move grain from surplus regions to famine zones, bring troops to rebellions before they spread. Distance stopped being a barrier and became a variable, something rulers, merchants and migrants could plan around. Speed, too, stopped being an occasional burst of effort and became an infrastructure. Relay posts, way stations, stables, breeding programs, courier networks, cavalry remount systems, these were early experiments in scaling time itself. How quickly can an order move from the centre to the edge? How fast can a message return? Once you start thinking that way, you don't stop when the animal changes. Railways, telegraphs, highways, fibre optic cables, each one is a more abstract descendant of the horse road. Power shifted as well. Horse ownership drew bright new lines between people. In many societies, to have a horse was to belong to an elite, to be a knight, a mounted archer, a charioteer, a landowner. Whole classes defined themselves by their relationship to this animal, and states measured their strength in remounts and horse archers as much as in coins and grain. At the same time, horses quietly expanded what a state could be. Census systems, tribute routes, borders that could actually be patrolled, capital cities that expected obedience from mountains away, all of these depended on hooves. When we talk about state capacity today, taxation, communication, enforcement, we're partly describing a pattern first tested with horses. And yet, when you follow the evidence closely, the story is not neat. We still argue about where riding really began, whether the Botai were first or one branch in a tree with deeper, more tangled roots. We debate how much chariots mattered compared to infantry, how decisive cavalry really was in different wars, how far horse postal systems actually reached. Archaeology revises old certainties every decade. Genetics continues to surprise us with new lineages, new migrations, new interbreeding events. Living with that uncertainty is part of doing history honestly. The past is not a finished book. It's more like a manuscript with missing pages, smudged ink, and marginal notes in different hands. Horses gallop through many of those pages, but not always in the ways we expect. Still, through all the gaps, one relationship stands out. For thousands of years, humans lived side by side with an animal that was large enough to kill us by accident and sensitive enough to respond to the lightest touch. We learned to read ears, eyes, breathing, the tension in a flank. We bred them for speed and strength, but we also bred them for temperament, for the ability to share space and danger with us. In return, horses learned us. They adapted to our voice tones, our postures, our routines. They carried our kings and our refugees, our mail and our ploughs. They went with us into battles they didn't choose, and brought us home from journeys we could not have made alone. That long partnership left marks inside our minds. Our myths fill the sky with horse constellations, hitch gods to chariots of light, imagine afterlives with endless meadows. Our languages use horses as metaphors for restraint and release, for pride and humility, for labour and wildness. Even now, when most of us never work with horses at all, the idea of riding still stands in for freedom, mastery, escape. Living so closely with something powerful but not human seems to have trained us in a particular kind of imagination, the ability to see agency outside ourselves, to think of cooperation with other minds as a source of strength instead of a threat. It nudged us towards seeing power not just as domination, but as coordination, many bodies moving as one, whether in a cavalry charge or a plough team. You could say that horses helped rehearse civilization itself. They demanded roads, rules, disciplines, and care. They rewarded planning and punished cruelty or neglect. They turned abstract ideas, speed, distance, command, into sensations you could feel in your own muscles, with sweat on your hands and wind in your face. Engines have taken over most of their old jobs. Satellites have replaced beacon fires on ridgelines. But that deep memory of partnership lingers. It is there whenever we talk about horsepower, whenever a child dreams of running faster than their legs will carry them, whenever we imagine freedom as something you ride. If you've enjoyed drifting through this secret history tonight, you might like to wander even further back, into the deep prehistoric bottlenecks, the near extinctions, the strange cousins and survivors that shaped us long before the first hoofprint beside a camp. I've put those stories, and many more, into a book about the prehistoric secrets of our species. If you'd like to read more or find out how to get a copy, you can visit sleepytimehistory.com. If you're still awake, and if you are, you're a dedicated traveller, please consider gently tapping like, or leaving a comment. Tell me where in the world you're listening from, and whether there are other animals or eras you'd like to explore on future nights. And if you'd like more slow, careful journeys through the past, you can subscribe, so the next story finds you when you're ready to sleep. For now, wherever you are, and whatever roads lie under your own life, remember, our world was rewired by hooves long before it was wired by code. And some part of that rhythm is still beating quietly, just under the surface, every time we imagine a different way to move through the dark.